Welcome, everyone. Ask that you take your seats, please, so we can begin. We have a very packed schedule for this afternoon, so we'd like to get started as quickly as possible. My name is Matthew Continetti. I am the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conference this afternoon, The Promise and Peril of Civic Renewal, Richard Neuhaus, Peter Berger, and To Empower People. I'd like to extend a special welcome and thanks to my friend Ryan Anderson, President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, who is co-sponsoring today's conference and has done all the hard work in helping me put it together. And I'd like to note as well that our colleague Mary Eberstadt of the Faith and Reason Institute, who was originally slated for today's program, is unable to join us. Mary sends her regards, and we send her our well wishes as well. In 1977, Richard John Neuhaus and Peter Berger published a pamphlet under the auspices of the American Enterprise Institute with the title, To Empower People, From State to Civil Society. The essay examined the crucial importance of mediating structures, such as family, church, and neighborhood, to a healthy civil society. It argued that public policy should take these institutions seriously to provide an alternative to the services of the modern welfare state. These mediating institutions provide a free and self-governing society with a moral foundation. Neuhaus and Berger understood that without the guidance of mediating institutions, our political order will become detached from the values and realities of social life. When that happens, they wrote, the political order must be secured by coercion rather than by consent. And when that happens, democracy disappears. Today, our institutions are in decline, and the weakening of their role in public life is causing social trust and cohesion to erode. And the feedback loop is negative. The decline in trust then leads to further alienation from institutions. In a moment where the mediating structures that Neuhaus and Berger described must urgently be revived, the insights of To Empower People are more significant than ever. AEI and EPPC have assembled a remarkable cohort of scholars this afternoon to assess the legacy of the Neuhaus-Berger project. On two panels, speakers will explore how Neuhaus and Berger's work can be applied to challenges we face in contemporary American life. The first panel, which I will moderate, will focus on questions of public policy. Then we will have a short break, followed by the second panel, which will be moderated by Ryan Anderson. That panel will focus on issues of culture. Then, finally, we will ask our friend and colleague, and yes, my one-time boss, as well as Ryan's one-time boss, Joseph Bottom, to offer some closing reflections. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce George Weigel, a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And George will kick off the afternoon with a talk on Neuhaus and Berger's work and its continued relevance. One of America's leading public intellectuals, George holds EPPC's William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies. He is the author and editor of more than 30 books, most notably his widely translated and internationally acclaimed two-volume biography of Pope St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope, and its sequel, The End and the Beginning. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recommend one of my favorites from George's corpus, the book Not Forgotten, Elegies for and Reminiscences of a Diverse Cast of Characters, most of them admirable. George Weigel is certainly admirable. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been thinking about changing that CV that Matt just read a bit of, because in the present state of our national culture and intellectual life, being described as one of America's leading public intellectuals is perilously close to being described as the greatest shortstop in Kazakhstan, I think. But be that as it may, I'm very grateful to Ryan and Matt for inviting me to kick this off. To ask me to say a few words about Richard John Neuhaus and Peter Berger is to ask me to take a trip down a very long memory lane. one of the great graces of my life is that I have had the privilege of working as colleagues with men and women whom I first met intellectually by reading their books in college and graduate school, at which point I could not have imagined that we would eventually be working together. Thus, in my sociology courses in college, I read Peter's remarkable Invitation to Sociology, a humanistic perspective. The subtitle being key to that book, I think. This was Peter putting down his marker that social science was not simply a matter of number crunching, but that social science had to be in conversation with philosophy, theology, literature, and the other humane sciences. The Social Construction of Reality, I think many of us read at that point. A Rumor of Angels, a book that is still very much worth reading 55 years after its publication, which was a frontal challenge to what was then known as secular theology. Harvey Cox, The Secular City, things like that. And then the book that, a little book that Richard and Peter did together called Movement and Revolution, which was their first joint probe into thinking about the renewal of American society, culture, and politics. When I was in graduate school, another Berger Neuhaus double-header had a profound effect and continues to have a profound effect on me. It's not really on our agenda today, but I'm going to mention it anyway because I think it's so important in talking about the project, and that is the book Against the World, for the World, The Hartford Appeal and the Future of American Religion. This was a book that came out of a multi-day conference at the Hartford Theological Seminary in 1976. What it really came out of was a post-dinner conversation in which Richard and Peter were sitting at Peter and Brigida's kitchen table, smoking cigarillos, as they did at a great rate, and jotting down on a pad all of the things that most annoyed them about liberal theology. They then gathered a group of rather broad-ranging Christian intellectuals for 2 or 3 days at the Hartford Theological Seminary, refined that list, then had many of the participants write essays, and I think that book and that effort, which was, of course, immediately dismissed by the theological left as the so-called Hartford heresies, I think that book marked a real turning point in American religious thought. Jody might have some things to say about that afterwards. It was a frontal assault on that watered-down form of Christianity that H. Richard Niebuhr most famously described as a God without wrath, brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. And some of the flourishing we have seen of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox theology in the United States in the 50 years since then, almost 50 years since the Hartford Appeal, I think is a direct result of that and the many networks of conversation that came out of that, not least of which, of course, was the journal First Things. In the late 1970s, when I had moved from academic life into the think tank and journalism world, Peter's essay in Commentary, Are Human Rights Universal, had a profound effect on me and still seems to me very much worth engaging. So when I began to get to know and work with these two remarkable personalities, they'd already had a significant effect on my thinking. I think we have to say, and I think we can say, at least at the American Enterprise Institute and the Ethics and Public Policy Center, that the collaboration of Richard and Peter was itself something of an act of providence. one could not have imagined these two men in their youth ever coming together to form this powerful intellectual team. Peter, of course, grew up in a Jewish family in Vienna, which got out to mandatory Palestine just in time. In the late 1930s, there he became a Christian and eventually found himself teaching at the New School for Social Research, where he quickly became something of an intellectual all-star. Richard was the Canadian-born U.S. citizen, pastor's kid from Pembroke, Ontario, with no high school diploma. Someone asked if we were going to tell Neuhaus stories today. I will tell at least this one Neuhaus story. Richard was thrown out of a Lutheran high school in Nebraska for misbehavior. I think this involved at least smoking and drinking and may have involved other shenanigans as well. So after spending a year or so running a gas station and general store in Cisco, Texas, which he used to say, Cisco, Texas is in West Texas, and about West Texas it said there's nothing wrong with West Texas that couldn't be improved by a little water and a few good people, of which someone would always say the same could be said of hell. He decided that the commercial life was not for him, and he went to Concordia College in Austin, Texas, where there were two lines for registration. There was a high school line and a college line. And he thought, well, any sensible person would go into the college line. And he gets to the front of the college line, and the registrar says, "I'm sorry, we haven't received your high school diploma." And Richard, not wanting to violate the seventh commandment, simply said, "Well, I hope you will receive it soon." 4 years later, he was graduating at the top of his class, and there still was no high school diploma, but it was thought it wouldn't look too good for the school if they denied the star the bachelor's degree. So here's this guy who goes from that little adventure to the seminary in St. Louis, the Missouri Seminary in St. Louis, spent 6 months as a pastor in Medina, New York, and then takes over a absolutely ramshackle, rundown Lutheran parish in what was then the really impoverished and crummy section called Bedford-Stuyvesant in the Brooklyn borough of New York. Bed-Stuy, of course, has been completely gentrified since then. There was no salary. There was a small congregation of Black and Hispanic Lutherans. And out of that place, Richard built a dynamic Christian congregation and came to know Peter Berger, because Peter and Brigitte started coming to what Richard always referred to as St. John the Mundane, as to distinguish the parish from St. John the Divine on Morningside Heights. Nobody laughs at Neuhaus stories. What is this? You guys, do you want a nap here? What is this? These are the good Neuhaus stories. You want Neuhaus stories. All right. It was at that parish, I think, that something that was terribly important in Richard's intellectual life and in some sense his spiritual life came into focus for him. As I say, this was a parish of very poor people, and the notion of quality of life as a measure of whatever was beginning to come into play, and someone, I can't remember the name of the author, a complete secularist, of course, wrote an article about trying to define quality of life, and I think it was the Atlantic or the New Yorker or something like that. And Richard said, I was up in the pulpit preaching on the following Sunday after reading that article, and it occurred to me that not a single one of my congregants had what this liberal secular world would consider a quality of life. Something was wrong here. There was a disconnect between liberal thinking about the social order and the reality of what he was dealing with every day as a pastor. So two first-class minds whose very biographies led them to be both empirically sensitive, intellectually curious, and a bit contrarian, somehow found each other in Bedford-Stuyvesant in the 1960s and 70s, and the result of that is our being together here today. Now, I think to empower people, to get down to the point here, is a reflection of this intellectual feistiness and a certain contrariness. It was not so much, at least as I understand it, an attempt to define a middle ground between libertarianism and statism, but ground ahead of the old left-right categories. And in doing so, it was an attempt to recover, for a broader audience, a sense of the importance of what I would call the third fundamental building block of Catholic social doctrine, namely the principle of subsidiarity. For those of you not so conversant with Catholic social doctrine, let me simply say that this word, subsidiarity, which is being awfully misused in some circles today, entered the Catholic magisterial conversation in 1931 when Pope Pius XI issued the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno to mark the 40th anniversary of Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which was the initial encyclical in the social doctrine tradition. And to the two principles that Leo articulated, the principle of personalism and the principle of the common good, under the shadow of totalitarianism, Pius XI began to talk about the principle of subsidiarity, which I have always interpreted as a direct confrontation with the statism implied in the totalitarian project in all of its dimensions. Pius, of course, being particularly aware of Mussolini's definition of the totalitarian project as everything inside the state, everything for the state, nothing against the state. The tendency of the modern state to enlarge the sphere of its, not only its alleged competence, but its power, did not die with the death of Italian fascism or German National Socialism, and it certainly did not die with the death of Soviet communism. We remember, for example, the Life of Julia ad during the 2012 Obama presidential campaign, in which this cartoon person walked through life as if the only two actors in her life were herself and the state. This is one of the many things that To Empower People was intended to correct by arguing, as Matt suggested in his introduction, there are multiple actors in any healthy society. There are levels of authority in any healthy society. This was the point of Pius XI and subsidiarity. And while I will leave it to others to assess how well the Empower People proposals have worked their way into the texture of American society and American public policy, I will say that we certainly see some positive signs today that this project has had some effect. I think particularly of charter schools, the school choice movement, the homeschooling movement, as emblematic of the approach. to society, culture, and politics that was advanced into empower people. As for the second panel, mediating institutions and culture, later in his life, Berger spent a great deal of his intellectual effort trying to understand the problem of modernity and social cohesion. Let me simply quote from a fine article by Jonathan Imber, a former student and longtime colleague of Peter's, describing, this is the introduction to an anthology of Berger articles, and he pulls out of that something that I think is important from Peter, who wrote, as far as the normative order of society is concerned, the single most important consequence of modernization is the pluralization of beliefs and values. Despite various challenges, including bloody ones, pre-modern societies frequently had a reasonable chance of maintaining a unified system of norms that could command allegiance, be it by force or more or less freely, from the great majority of the population. Modernization made such a project more and more difficult. Thus, pluralism becomes not just a fact, but a virtue, to wit, the idea of people with different beliefs and values living in a state of civic peace. Now, that is obviously, and ever more obviously, an unresolved dilemma. We see it all over the place in our country. And I think another great mind of a generation before, John Courtney Murray, shed some light on this in his book, We Hold These Truths, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition, in which he distinguishes in a way that I don't think Peter really did between plurality and pluralism. Plurality is the fact of difference, and that, as Peter obviously knew, is the native condition of modernity. Pluralism, at least Murray would argue, is a social achievement. It's what he called in that book creeds intelligibly in conflict. Talking to each other through a common grammar, which Murray believed could be provided by the natural moral law, even though there were fundamental disagreements on more basic questions of theology and perhaps even of metaphysics. Now, Ryan Anderson, in inviting me to share some few thoughts with you, asked me to say a word about how the Neuhaus project is faring. Well, first of all, let's define the project, which was, I think, Richard did on numerous occasions when he said the project is the development of a religiously informed public philosophy for the American experiment in ordered liberty, which is another way of saying building pluralism out of plurality. Now, to state the obvious, the project has obviously not carried the day, but it still seems to me an apt description of what a pluralistic country, in both senses, plurality, the fact of plurality, and the pluralism sense of creeds intelligibly in conflict, needs. I think the unanticipated problem, which has become ever more evident since both of these men died, is the collapse of a concept of human nature from which the precepts of a rational public ethic could be discerned. It's very hard to talk about the natural moral law, for example, when there is no such thing as human nature. And I, for example, can get up in the morning and define myself as Georgina, and everybody is supposed to acknowledge that as a matter of my human rights. Now, Richard certainly wrote a lot about the problems of what he used to call the imperial autonomous self. But that imperial autonomous self has become more imperial and even more autonomous since his death in 2009. I think we see this most dramatically last week, most poignantly last week, in the Biden administration's new Title IX regulations on trans athletes. This is the latest example, showing us really what an absurd situation we find ourselves in when an appeal is being made to Title IX through the regulatory process to completely undo the purpose of Title IX. Both Berger and Neuhaus knew that politics is downstream from culture. If the culture becomes debased, and has become debased, to a degree that they might not have imagined possible, so would politics and public policy. So cultural renewal and reform, mediated through and animated by creative minorities working in these mediating institutions, would seem to be the strategic path forward, even as we take what wins we can and play as good defense as we can on the public policy front. So I hope those brief thoughts offer a few things to chew on over the next couple of hours. Thank you.
Thank you, George. We'll move right into our first panel here. Talk about public policy, what it has done, what it might be able to do. I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists, starting at the end. Catherine Ruth Pakuluk is the Director of Social Research and an Associate Professor at the Catholic University of America's Bush School of Business. Her primary research areas include family studies and demography, Catholic social thought, and political economy. She is the 2015 recipient of the Acton Institute's Novak Award, a prize given for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty, and she is the author of a forthcoming or just published book, Hannah's Children, right? Which is an excellent study that I'd hope to ask her about large families. Next to Catherine is my colleague Scott Winship. He is a senior fellow and the director of the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility at AEI, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty. He also focuses on economic insecurity and inequality, among other poverty-related issues. He is an honorary member of the Board of Advisors at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and his writing appears regularly in the popular press, and he has one of the most controversial Twitter feeds, I think, there is. But that's good, because it's good to stir up controversy. And then finally, next to me is Patrick T. Brown. He is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work focuses on supporting families as the cornerstone of a healthy American society. Patrick's writing has appeared in a wide range of outlets, and he speaks regularly on Capitol Hill and on college campuses. He is an advisory board member of Humanity Forward and the Center on Child and Family Policy, and a contributing editor to Public Discourse. So thank you all for joining us. Scott, I'm going to kick things off with you, so you can also offer rebuttal to my characterization of your Twitter feed if you so choose. But I thought I'd just open the discussion with the general question, which is, as we look back on the legacy of To Empower People, what did public policy do to civil society? And is there any way that public policy can undo what has been done to civil society?
You write one tweet on the extinction of humanity and like you get a bad reputation about your Twitter feed. Don't understand it. Thanks, Matt. And thanks to everyone for coming. A pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm excited. We did an event last year on social capital, and in the course of that, I managed to get a copy, I think maybe from Carlin, of the original 1977 To Empower People, which has a library card in the back. If you're a young person, come and talk to me afterwards. I'll let you know how libraries worked back in the day. To your question, Matt, I think it's interesting. The book came out in 1977, so we're 47 years out. It was prescient in many ways. I think the ways that public policy have affected mediating structures, almost entirely for the worse, I think, are severalfold. So if you think of the mediating structures that Berger and Neuhaus talk about as being families, churches, neighborhoods, and voluntary associations, I think you can start with the family. You can look at safety net policy and the way that that's evolved, which has made it much less important to have kids within marriage, for instance. We've seen out of wedlock births rise over time. Even since the 1970s, the non-marital birth rate rose for another 20 years after that, and then welfare reform seems to have leveled it off. You can think of neighborhoods, and you can think of things like urban planning, some of the redlining that the federal government was complicit in that created a lot of impoverished neighborhoods, cut them off from the broader outside world. You can think of certainly churches and voluntary associations and all of the ways that federal policy has made it more difficult for those organizations to serve their members through either through excessive regulation, certifications, things like that. More generally, the federal government has just taken on more and more roles that formerly were served by families, by local organizations, even by local government, state government. It's crowded out our ability to do things together. A lot of these social capital muscles have atrophied. So I think reversing course is going to have to require devolving some things back to civil society into local government. What can public policy do going forward? So before I was at AEI, I was the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee for Senator Mike Lee, where I ran something called the Social Capital Project. I brilliantly hired a young Patrick Brown just out of graduate school. And we spent the last couple of years that I was there trying to think about policies to revive civil society in the mediating structures. And there's a whole range of things that could be done. I think you could try to strengthen families through safety net reforms that involve work requirements and time limits so that people can't rely on the safety net as a way of life and as a replacement for two-parent families. You can imagine providing marriage bonuses through our refundable tax credits, where you would actually give married couples more than just twice what they would get as single parents. There are all sorts of marriage penalties in the tax code aside from that we could deal with. If you think about delivering social services, which is certainly what Berger and Neuhaus were most interested in, we could build on the things that have happened since the publication of the book around charitable choice, allowing religious organizations to deliver services without having to deal with some of the red tape that otherwise would prevent them from doing so. We can think about ways to expand the residential choices that people have so that they can find communities that are most like what they're looking for through things like zoning reforms, land use regulations. We could encourage philanthropic giving through the charitable tax deduction reforms. We could encourage pluralism in education. Patrick wrote a great paper on that at JEC by letting school districts have more leeway to tailor the way that they teach kids to community efforts. So it feels a lot of times like there's not much that federal policy or government policy in general could do to promote civil society and to promote mediating structures. But I think if you think creatively about it, there's actually a whole lot of little things that if we did them all together would add up to a revival.
Thanks, Scott. Catherine, I'd like to turn to you now. I'm curious about your reflections on Scott's comments, but also I think be helpful to start with one of those mediating institutions that Berger and Neuhaus talked about, the family. And certainly your research that led into Hannah's Children at least seems to me to suggest there is one corner of family life that is actually kind of prospering on its own.
Sure. Yeah. You mean the 5%?
Yes, the 5%.
I guess we'd like to see that be 20% or 30%, right?
You got to start somewhere.
Yeah. No. So maybe that's a good moment to clarify the instructive value of the 5%, right? So who are the 5%? The 5% are the families that are immune from the birth dearth, the families that are having 3, 4, 5 or more children. And so they're instructive for a lot of reasons. But the thing that, and I'll come back to your question, but the reason I studied them is, in a sense, to try to discern what it is that gives people the drive, the motivation to do hard things. Because I think one of the things that we're abstracting from in the moment, right? We're thinking like we're almost doing this constructivist enterprise while we're paying a kind of lip service to the sense that, well, the important thing is that there's all these mediating structures and people should live in these little platoons. So we see that, we go, okay, well, let's whiteboard that. Let's put that on the board, and then and let's assign people to their proper spots. And now let's think how we can build these to be strong, right? But of course, that's just our descriptive after the fact. What we need, I mean, we don't build mediating institutions. We can undermine them, but they come from someplace. And the family is a great instance of this, right? The family is not something we can assign people to do. We could definitely get in the way of people who'd like to build families. So I was trying to investigate that question, sort of what are the sources of resilience? What are the types of things that give people the courage to tackle hard things? And one of the kinds of hard things we'd like them to do is raise kids and think that they're great and commit themselves to them forever. So that was the goal. And so I was kind of after ways in which I could understand and think about and actually put language on the ways that families draw strength from biblical convictions through church communities. And of course, that was the project. And so you said, well, some corner is flourishing. Right, and so this corner of family life is flourishing almost universally, that corner, that 5%. They're deeply embedded in I call them living religious communities. I'm unwilling to name particular churches because we all know they're not particular churches or particular organized churches. They're minority communities within particular traditions. And so, and if anything, I mean, then the job would be to sort of think, to orient ourselves to what that looks like. So families are embedded in these religious, the successful, flourishing families that are immune from these dire things. And so I think that's the thing I would want to bring to the table, is this kind of question of how these mediating institutions form themselves in the first place. We have nothing to support if people don't have the initiative to build them. Yeah.
And just to follow up briefly, I mean, what you seem to be indicating is that these flourishing institutions just kind of form despite all the obstacles, rather than because of any public policy.
Right. Well, in a sense, what I'm saying is there exist some living religious communities that are highly successful, and that families tapped into them draw tremendous amounts of support and shape values. And so, of course, we'd like to have more of that. We'd like that to not be 5%. And so we have to study them. We have to study them and figure out what they're doing differently. And so I don't understand that contribution in any sense be different from what Scott outlined. I think I'm very much in agreement with him that there's a lot of good news to be had. But we haven't looked for it in that sense. So I think the model is there. There are models we can explore and talk about. But the thing to think about is, the thing to avoid, I think, is a kind of constructivist view, like sitting in a boardroom, picking out the mediating institutions and aiming at them, because that actually won't work, not in that abstracted way.
Thank you. Patrick, so we've heard some good news. Maybe you can bring some bad news.
Oh, I'd be more than happy to. um, yeah, I think it's fascinating to read this document, almost a half century later, and think about how much America has changed despite their best efforts. The society that's reading this now is much more solitary than it was back then, much more suburban than it was, and much more single, much more secular. All of these things, talking about voluntary associations and church going and family formation itself, these are all have seen a winnowing and a hollowing out. Now, you might say that that's partly a vindication of their thesis, right? They were seeing into the future the trends and trying to forestall them, and if only we had listened to them, maybe we would have a different trend line to look at. I think part of it is also, and this is an insight that I'll credit to Scott as helping shape my thinking on this when we were working together on the Hill, is recognizing that things like voluntary associations or forming a family or any of these choices are, have an economic dimension to them too, right? Or at least a lens of self-interest, where people don't just come together to go to Kiwanis for fun. They do it because the benefit outweighs the cost to them, whether that's a material benefit or a social benefit or something, or a personal benefit. It's similarly, Catherine's work and her great ethnography of these moms who have 5 or more kids, they're doing it because it's not an irrational choice. They see their personal benefits of having a large family and living, even if it's a materially poorer lifestyle, they see it as spiritually richer. These are all choices that suggest that the trends that they were seeing, that Bob Putnam and others have written about, these are in some respects people's choices to participate less in civil society or participate less in their church. And as society has gotten richer and we can afford more things that we used to have to rely on civil society for, well, maybe we have to think about what an intermediating institution looks like a little differently now than it did in 1977. I think, certainly the neighborhood is an example of one where I think that's really hard to see what that looks like in 21st century America. I think for a lot of Americans living in your sort of, classic cookie cutter subdivision, like, your neighbors are the people who happen to buy a house next to you. It's not, the Godfather, sort of neighborhood style where you have these thick networks of overlapping relatives and extended families and that sort of thing. That's just not, that's not the America of 2024. And I think, the tapestry that they were writing about, we have a much more diverse nation even today than they did in 77. So thinking about the challenges that poses too to their sort of, I think, most of the examples they give of diversity throughout the pamphlet are sort of white versus black neighborhoods, and obviously it's a much more complex picture today. So I think those are all some of the challenges that we have to think about, how we can apply their insights going forward.
Scott, the pamphlet inaugurated a whole series of conferences and further work and research into how the center right in particular, but also eventually the center left, and became very interested in the idea of civil society, how actors across the public spectrum could invigorate these mediating institutions. And we seem to have had a few projects, wide-scale political projects, in order to somehow tie public policy at the federal level to mediating institutions. Could you describe some of those and what your interpretation of their record is?
Yeah, I think it's been mixed. I think there have been a few bursts of energy that have had some positive impacts, but they've kind of been few and far between. I think the ones that I would point to, you can sort of start with something like the first President Bush's 1,000 Points of Light, which was an attempt to acknowledge people who are volunteering, and to eventually it created an organization that promoted volunteering, connected people to different places where they could volunteer. Fairly small scale. Continuing to the 90s, you have a few interesting things. You have charitable choice rules that I mentioned earlier that really started with the Welfare Reform Bill in 1996 as an attempt to allow religious organizations to compete with government in supplying social services. You have the charter school movement that George mentioned, which I think is a really interesting model. The federal government basically said to states, if you authorize charter schools and commit to a longer-term funding stream, we will give you essentially startup funds from the federal government to launch those, and then those funds are going to go away, and it's going to be up to you to continue them. I think that's had a really important impact in expanding school choice. You can look at kind of more center-left things like AmeriCorps, which encouraged a lot of volunteering also. A lot of conservatives don't like AmeriCorps because volunteering isn't really volunteering if you're getting paid, and Senator Lee was never a fan of AmeriCorps. But you can sort of see the roots of to empower people in an initiative like that. You had George Bush's the second George Bush's faith-based initiative program. That office still exists. It's been renamed. It's probably less active than it was at one point. But that was an effort, again, to promote charitable choice and give religious institutions a bigger role in delivering services. And then I think the most recent thing that I would point to, which is in some ways, I think the most interesting and exciting, people sort of forget Paul Ryan in 2014 had a pretty big, ambitious safety net reform proposal that, among other things, would have, again, allowed local nonprofits, including religious institutions, to deliver safety net benefits to folks instead of state bureaucrats, local bureaucrats. I think that, if it had developed more interest, would have been a really interesting way to take our safety net. Put it in the hands of folks who know the people in their community, who have the flexibility to personalize benefits and tailor them not only to local circumstances, but to individual circumstances. That's probably the closest I've seen to a proposal that is really in the spirit of what Berger and Neuhaus were talking about. Last thing I'll say, I think it's interesting, again, they're writing in 1977 when the federal government was a lot smaller, but their original vision wasn't about necessarily government doing less. It was about a different role for government. So the quote I have is, we suggest that the modern welfare state is here to stay, indeed that it ought to expand the benefits it provides. This is 1977, we did that. But that alternative mechanisms are possible to provide welfare state services. So it's really about changing the way that we deliver them. And it's really not even in much of the book about the actual benefits that people get from these programs. It's more about how they get them and how it makes them feel part of something instead of being alienated from the mega structures, I think is what they call them in the book, the big institutions, including government of society.
Yeah, there's something of a paradox there, because these mediating institutions formed in order to provide the social services that are then taken on by the state. And I think it was the conservative sociologist Robert Nisbet, I was talking to Steve Hayward earlier about, who said that once you deprive an institution of its function, that institution will collapse. And so, Catherine, I want to ask you a little bit about the really kind of the institution, it seems to me, that is the mediating institution, and that's religious faith. You already talked about it, that these women who choose to raise 5 or more children come from living religious communities. And of course, when you think about just, say, the golden age of American mediating institutions, that was a golden age of American religion in many ways, right? With religious schooling, certain public religion, and also a host of voluntary activities tied to religious groups and organizations. Did that come out in your ethnography? And then did the women that you write about, do they feel as though the secular culture is arrayed against them?
Yeah, Yes, well, to the last point, yes, they did feel that the secular culture was against them, though not in some sort of, big conspiracy theory sense. It wasn't a direct subject, but of course it comes up. I asked them, for instance, why do you think other women don't make the same choices that you make? And so in that respect, they will bring things out like, well, college classes where they tell you that it's irresponsible to have children. I mean, so they'll mention these sort of secular forces, but they also indicated, again, these kind of language of resilience. It doesn't matter what the world thinks. My identity doesn't come from there. True wealth doesn't come from what says. I mean, so these are the kinds of things we'd like people to have in general. Is those kinds of that kind of resilience. I wanted just to underscore, I think, the importance of that line by Nisbet. I mean, I was thinking about it and thinking about this conference. Another sociologist writing at the same time as Nisbet is Ivan Illich, and I think that Ivan Illich used the word, which we can all use now, thanks to Abigail Schreier, iatrogenic. And he used iatrogenic, which we now think of as, when medical treatments do harm by the healer. But Illich meant it in relation to, oddly enough, not just the megastructures, but actually Illich used it in relation even to sort of smaller structures, right? So famously, Illich said, well, it may be the case that educational disadvantage cannot be cured in the school. What he meant by that is kind of interesting, but of course what he was really getting at was the way in which structures that are designed by a third party to administer progress through predetermined checkpoints, that they, in a sense, create dependence without the intention of creating dependence. So this is the thing that you're getting at, which is this, like, deprive it of the function and the thing itself dissolves. So I think it might be fair to reconsider whether iatrogenic harm in relation to certain kinds of programs might be the flavor of the critique, right? That you can hurt an institution by helping it too much. Maybe you can hurt it by helping it at all. And it seems to me one part of assessing the legacy of this pamphlet is to ask to what extent we've done that and where and in what ways, and are there kind of sufficient institutions, in a sense, particular institutions that if you can look to the health of these ones, the rest will kind of fall into line.
Patrick, you pointed out earlier in a conversation the way in which to empower people is a critique of both left and right. And I think George kind of mentioned this in his comments as well. What in particular struck you about the pamphlet's critique of the right?
Well, it picks right up on where Catherine's heading with that comment, I think, because this isn't a pamphlet that has a sort of classic libertarian approach to public policy. Says, oh, if we just sort of remove the superstructure that is infringing on civil society, it will naturally sort of grow back up again. But in the discussion that they talk about daycare, they say, well, we don't think we should have no daycare. We don't think we should have a public school-related daycare. We want to have, actually, touching on something, a paper that I wrote for the Niskanen Center a couple of years ago, this idea of childcare pluralism, where we're sort of saying, well, we're going to have a role for funding childcare, but what that's going to look like is going to look different for a collective of lesbian moms in Brooklyn versus Mormon moms in Utah. Like, we're going to have a very pluralistic approach to what that might look like, but recognizing that there is a role for the state to sort of provide the sort of support. I think one thing that they're picking up on, that it's interesting to read, again, these decades later, is they say this is a form of populism, right? And they're trying to restore a sense of agency to people, because one example they give that comes up again and again in the paper, and also in Christopher Lash's book, which is written around the same time, Haven in a Heartless World, is the rise of these sort of parenting experts, and this worry that parents are going to feel so constrained about what they can do to their kids because of the sort of class of people who are going to tell them that, Dr. Spock or whatever are going to tell them they're raising their kids the wrong way. And so in a sense, they're picking off something real, right? This idea that like, you're not able to live your values the way that you want to, or you're constrained by bureaucracy. You feel like you don't have, again, that sense of agency. Ian Rowe, who's at AI, wrote a book called Agency a year or two ago on this theme. And I think if we're thinking about today, what that looks like, it's not necessarily state driven. Now, I think there are there are some great examples of, certainly, George mentioned Title IX and the sort of unholy marriage between civil rights law and woke corporations that somebody like Christopher Caldwell's written about. There's obviously examples of people feeling like they're being impinged on by state action, but often it's again, it's the market as well, crowding out their ability to use the pronouns they want to or whatever that is, feeling like there's social or economic, as Brendan Ike at Mozilla, right? Whether the harms of not being able to live out your faith and your values in the public square, that's a loss of agency that I think they were tapping into. That, again, is there a libertarian approach to some of that? Yes, but also giving people the tools to be able to combat that through affirmative, robust defense mechanism like George talked about, or even something like in healthcare insurance. And everybody knows the example of being trapped in a bureaucracy that you're bouncing between provider and payer and all these different things. Maybe the sort of empowering people approach is a more aggressive approach to healthcare regulation or something like that. I'm spitballing here. Don't quote me on that necessarily, but you could think about a government that is actually on the side of the individual or the family as a unit, saying, well, we're going to constrain the sphere of freedom for these corporations or these decisions or whatever. That might be a way of empowering people that I think is in the spirit of Berger and Neuhaus, even if not necessarily in the text.
Scott, the concept of subsidiarity was discussed in the opening remarks, this idea that decisions need to be devolved to the lowest possible level. We have, of course, the federalist tradition and our own political tradition as well. And it seems to me that for decades, conservatives or other people who are inclined to be friendly to the Neuhaus-Berger thesis would stress those two ideas, subsidiarity and federalism. And yet it seems like we are reminded again and again that they are not panaceas, that there's always a struggle between various levels of government, and that sometimes even devolution doesn't quite work out as planned. What lessons should we take from that experience?
Yeah, I think there are at least a couple of tensions. If you have spent any time talking with Robert Rector at the Heritage Foundation about welfare reform, he will tell you that the big mistake of welfare reform is that we said stuff to the states, and those people in the states didn't know what they were doing, and that was a mistake. We should not have done that. A very anti-federalist sentiment, which is to do with the incentives that state bureaucrats or local bureaucrats have, which might not be aligned to the goals of federal policy, for instance. So I think there's an issue of whether the incentives between federal and state and local governments are aligned, and that would certainly be true if we devolved more to civil society as well. The other tension, I think, is one of capacity. I think there is sometimes a tendency on the right to view civil society in a little bit with a Pollyanna-ish lens, I think, and to sort of think about, before the Great Depression, when communities were taking care of themselves just fine, thank you very much, and then we expanded the welfare state, and all of the problems since then are a result of that. I'm a critic of the welfare state for sure, but there is a reason that during the Great Depression, the federal government ended up being the lead actor rather than states or localities or civil society, right? The federal government has some advantages, which is why it has an important role to play It can borrow more easily than states and localities during downturns, for instance. It can do some redistribution, which is a dirty word, but on the other hand, if you're a poor person in Mississippi and telling them that, well, we're going to let Mississippi handle all of your problems, Mississippi is in the worst position to help a poor Mississippian in a lot of ways. And so there is a need to have a strong federal role, as Berger and Neuhaus note, but it just needs to be very different. And I think we need to do a lot of experimentation to figure out what works. We need to evaluate very rigorously anything that we do try to devolve. But I do think it's, we haven't talked much about this, but I think just for sake of national solidarity and dealing with polarization, which threatens to tear us apart, I think sometimes we've got to sort of remove some of the stuff that the federal government is doing, because otherwise, people are convinced that that their lives are going to be determined by folks who don't necessarily share their values in a faraway place, and every election becomes, a battle to the death.
Could I just add to that? Some deep agreement with what both the panelists said. This question of why isn't subsidiarity federalism enough in devolving things to the lowest level? Can I just use a really dumb example?
Anytime.
All right, here's a dumb example, but it's an easy one, right? I mean, so what we expect that people need to do in their lives, like a picture of human flourishing. They grow up, they've developed some set of virtues. Let's hope a few. They need to essentially form families. Work for a long time, educate their children, and then take care of the elderly, right? Or they get taken care of. I mean, the thing that people have to do is a difficult thing. And of course, there's community involvement, all those. So it's like you need people to run a marathon. And the nature of the iatrogenic harm that can come around from these higher levels, and we're thinking about, well, what isn't it good enough to just devolve things back to the lower level? It's not good enough, because the nature of that kind of harm is that people lose the drive and the desire to run the marathon. They don't want to run the marathon. And that can happen. If you do that for enough generations, nobody wants to do it anymore, because no one needs to run marathons. There's the things that you ran the marathon for, you can get in other places. We know this, right? So living religious communities didn't just bounce back after the fall of the Soviet Union. You can destroy it. This is social capital that's just gone. So the thought that we could just roll it back, devolve things back to the lower level, depends upon the thought that the nature of the individuals and the small families it'll spring forth. That the drive will be there, but I don't think it is there. In a lot of cases, it's not there. So that's, I think, the piece of bad news, or the thing that we might have to face is well, you have to rebuild, but you're rebuilding with pieces, sort of puzzle pieces that don't know what puzzle they belong to anymore. And of course, I think that can be done, but I think that's where we have to lean into the church.
And of course, there's the risk that when you try to rebuild, you will also have that iatrogenic harm as well, right?
It's
Even
there,
with the
right.
rebuilding. Patrick, you've given some thought to these questions. Where do you land on them?
Well, I was thinking when Catherine was talking about the sort of Madisonian idea of faction and what faction looked like in the context when they're writing, and again, just trying to follow through what the logic looks like today. And in some respects, it's a little challenging, because I think they're assuming that the pluribus is going to have a lot of different values, and they're going to be different in Kokomo and New Orleans and they naming all these different places. And I almost wonder if that assumption is a lot more less tenable today. The idea that I think it was. We used to have local censorship boards, and you would have banned in Boston, right? Because you would some literature or film was not appropriate for the people of Boston. You have to go down to New York if you wanted to see it. That's obviously, geography is not the right way to think about this anymore. And certainly, if anybody who lives in Nashville or Austin or can tell you that the values of the sort of blue city in a red state, that's a very real tension that pluralism doesn't necessarily give us a good answer to. I think Scott's right in the sort of, federalism has a role and it can be a good one, but it's not always necessarily the cure-all. Thinking about subsidiarity as being the lowest appropriate level of authority when it comes to things like zoning, for example. I think, again, I don't have any good answers. I just only have questions. But these are all ways in which I think the sort of factions that we're in, especially in a post-social media environment where you're the elites of Atlanta and Boston maybe now have more in common than they did Atlanta and Gwinnett City or something did back in 1960, right? There's these polarization around not just politics but also educational lens. I think that makes geographic devolution a little more challenging. Not impossible, but definitely requires us to push on where federalism can play a role here.
We'll turn to the audience for some questions in a few moments, but maybe I'll just have at least one more question for our panelists. And if we've established that these institutions don't just spring back once the harms are removed, we do, though, have examples of new institutions coming into being. And Scott, I know that you've given some thought to some of the new types of local voluntary organizations that have appeared over the last few years. And why don't you name some names and talk about whether they should give us confidence about the future?
Yeah, when we were working on the Social Capital Project, we were looking for a lot of these examples and actually got to talk to some of the people who were involved. I think the most impressive example I've ever seen is an organization in Baltimore called Thread, which is not to be confused with Weave, the David Brooks Aspen Social Capital Project. We almost named ourselves the Social Fabric Project at the beginning, so there's a definite cloth textile metaphor.
But you need thread to weave.
Exactly.
So,
so Thread is sort of a super mentoring group, which is really something that's not even mentoring because it ends up being so participatory that the mentors, which they will do not call themselves mentors, end up being transformed at the same time as the youth that they're ostensibly serving. So essentially, they will find kids who are getting in trouble in the Baltimore schools. They'll sort of rope them in, saying, "Hey, we can help you out, connect you to some resources," and then it becomes almost impossible to leave, to the point where it's a little bit scary. But they've really transformed the lives of a bunch of the youth that they're targeting, but they're also in the process of transforming the lives of the volunteers who are ostensibly mentoring them. So I would recommend everybody check out Thread. There's another example, it used to be called the Family Independence Initiative, started by Mauricio Lim, I believe, in California. I think it's changed names now, and he's moved on to something else. But essentially, this was a group that tried to reach out to people in a community and gather them together in a small group. So say find 10 people, 10 moms or something, get them all together in a room, ask them what their main challenges are and what they would need to overcome those challenges. And invariably, it's not sort of the things that the eggheads like me would sort of be thinking about. It would be like very practical things about having a car sometimes, when they don't have one, to get their kid here or there, or something about getting a small amount of startup funding for something. And then they work with those folks to create their own solutions to those problems. Third example I would give is one that I saw firsthand in Charlotte, North Carolina. So some of you know Raj Chetty's research on economic mobility. Charlotte was, I believe, last among the major cities when Chetty's 2014 report came out. Turns out later on there's other research where they do better than last, but the fact that they finished last on this first report was shook some of the community leaders so much that they organized. There's a bunch of banks headquartered in Charlotte. These major banks got involved. Neighborhood community groups got involved. It was very democratic. Folks who otherwise wouldn't come across each other very often, except maybe on a jury duty, sitting in a room together, trying to figure out what Charlotte could do to increase their mobility rate. And I think there's actually research now showing that they have managed to move the needle since 2014 on their mobility.
Great. Catherine, maybe just the last question from me. Scott raised the issue in our email thread prior to the panel that perhaps Americans are just getting what they want. And just as the women who you write about in Hannah's Children find themselves in these living religious communities and choosing this life of mothering 5 or more children, many other Americans are making the opposite choices. How should we think about that? I mean, is it just a condition of modernity that we've been talking about, that people are going to make choices, and sometimes those choices may lead to much weaker mediating institutions than, say, Matt Continetti would prefer?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Maybe I can bridge the answer to something that's also hopeful. I think there's a lot of opportunities to imagine a future in which more people want to make choices that contribute to a flourishing society. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated Scott's comment. Maybe people didn't really resist maybe some of this, letting go, right? Because I mean, the flip side of agency is responsibility. I mean, there's kind of some work involved, and so I think like we postulate that some part of the fixed human nature that George mentioned is, we're a little bit lazy sometimes, and so I don't know that. Yeah, so I think that's right. Absolutely. So if we think, well, okay, what we have is a situation in which people may not want to build stable families or may not want to contribute to living religious communities, kind of ask the question, like, where are people's values formed? Right, and so we do have a monopolistic and very large public education system that is beginning to be cracked into, I think. So for me, that's the element of hope. I do not think, in fact, that that ultimately people are choosing a kind of bundle of things that seems to be optimal to them, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I'll get married after I do this, and so they wake up when they're 40 and they go, well, I did really want 3 kids, but I also did really want to finish that, second degree and I wanted 2 things that were in conflict. What helps you put 2 things that are in conflict in order so that you don't wake up at 40 and go, gee, I kind of think that other thing was more important, but I didn't know it had to have priority. Well, essentially our education, what we're seeing with the school movement is really encouraging. So other examples besides the one Scott's just mentioned, we all know that homeschooling has been rising dramatically since at least as long as we can remember measuring it, or early 1980s. COVID was a nice and interesting blip, but actually the trends, it doesn't really post-COVID. I mean, we're still on the same trend line. Hybrid homeschooling, which is, as I've just discovered, a whole thing that I didn't know about. There's a research center at Kennesaw State University trying to track and define hybrid homeschooling. And then there's the explosion of these microschools. So the microschools are super interesting. The reason I raise all of these things is because a tremendous number of these things are coming out of living religious communities. You say, like, who wants to educate kids? That's hard. Well, it turns out a lot of religious people would like to educate kids, if we can free them up to do so. So the last thing I want to say is sort of like, I think a lot of hope for the future for people making good choices and being helped to order their priorities lies in assisting living religious communities in running schools of various kinds. And so that means looking at the various ways in which we make it really hard to get licensed as a school, to hire teachers that are certified or not certified, to provide degrees. I mean, degree certification at the college level even, there are people who would like to disrupt the sort of standard college education. Accrediting boards, like all of that needs to be dialed back.
And place is so important too, right?
Yeah.
Having a
Yeah.
site, and I'm just thinking of the living religious communities in the Beltway area.
Yes.
They tend to be clusters
they're-
of people
yeah.
sharing a common faith, and
Yeah.
all of these institutions kind of spring up around that.
Yeah,
So
and
making it easier for those types of communities to
Making
form
it
should
easier.
be
I
very
mean, there are a
important.
lot of people in this country who would like to educate kids, more than are currently able to do so, and so freeing them up to do so. I kind of think it'll solve about 3 problems with one blow, right? I mean, or one boost, right? Because so much of families' lives are lived in proximity to the school. So if the school is in proximity or close alliance with the church, but you wake up, it's like the first place you go in the morning is the school. And then the first place you go after lunch is the school. And then you're making all these drop-offs, and like everything on the weekend is organized around the school. So if that, so much social capital is built around schools, we could fix that. There's a lot of, and that's not really that hard from the public policy perspective, I don't think. We're making tons of progress.
That's great. Well, let's open it up. We do have microphones. Please, just if you have a question, just let us know who you are, and yep, and please, put your statement in the form of a question, at least at the very end. And we'll start over here with Jody.
Catherine? Is this on? Yeah. I wonder if there's a parallel with the argument we were having with Robert Putnam, Amitai Etzioni, and that world of communitarians in the late 90s, early 2000s. Putnam's Bowling Alone article that caused a big stir was 95, and it took him 5 years to finish the book. But that argument was going on all along there. Bill Clinton is photographed carrying a copy of Amitai Etzioni's kind of popularization of that communitarian movement. And there were some of us in those days were arguing with Putnam. My argument with Putnam, and it was shared by, say, Peter Berkowitz, Marianne Glendon, Charles Murray to some degree, but mostly it was the kind of non-numbers guys who were saying to Putnam and the communitarian movement, which seemed to have real springs in its heels right at that moment, that they were making a category error. And the category error was this, that every successful community you ever looked at didn't have community as its goal. It had achieving some purpose at its goal, and it got the socio-political benefits of successful community from not having community as its goal, and no true valuable community ever emerged from the vague NPR-like idea that it would be really good if we had community. And it strikes me that is that parallel to what you're sort of seeing in these religious communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me give you an example, like a concrete example. One of the things that came out of my interviews with women embedded in these communities who have lots of kids, they have lots of kids, typically, the women I interviewed, because they essentially believe that children are expressions of God's goodness and the way that God wants to bless us. So, okay, but so watch what I'm going to do here. So then at some point you start asking them, well, what does it mean? And tell me about your family life and what's going on. And then all of a sudden they say, what do you like most about having all these kids? They go, well, you know what I like most is I like most watching my 14-year-old take care of my 5-year-old. And you go, well, it would be nice if we had more of that, wouldn't it be? Like if we had 14-year-old boys completely obsessed with taking care of their 5-year-old brother or sister, and you kind of scale that up and you say, oh, is this what everybody's talking about? The loss of like other-centeredness? And then you keep going down that line of questioning, and the women I'm talking about are saying, well, actually, like our households are stuffed full of examples of the kinds of things we think people ought to be doing when they grow up, right? But none of them would have said they had children in order to produce virtuous citizens. Not a one of them. So that's, it's an example of what you're speaking about. So you say, like, how do we get virtue in the citizenry? Do we incentivize virtue? Well, that's ridiculous. That's not how it works, right? At least that would be the argument. Yeah.
I think you could design a tax credit.
Can I just add one
Yeah, of
one
course,
thing out
before
there?
we turn to the Patrick.
Yeah, Derek Thompson is a staff writer at The Atlantic, and he wrote a piece last month or something saying, the problem with the decline in organized religion is that it turns out that people are unhappy and disconnected from their community and all these sort of things, which is, true in a sense. Obviously, if you're a believer, you think there's deeper problems with the disconnection with religion as well. But, it's a little, sort of funny to see people who are in the elite class all of a sudden recognizing, oh, gee, maybe the conservatives were onto something. If people are having children outside of marriage and not going to church, what fills that gap is not volunteering at the soup kitchen or something. It's watching Netflix, right? Or traveling the world or whatever that is. And we can be value neutral about it or not. But the fact is, like, the debates you're writing about, or you're talking about, Bill McClay wrote a piece for National Interest in, I think, 2001, basically saying, if people associate for a purpose, and when that purpose goes away, they're not going to keep associating just for the sake of doing that. And so, you don't want to take it too far and say, well, that means we should just have a really stingy safety net, and therefore people will be forced to go back and do things together. That's not obviously what Berger and Neuhaus were saying, and it's also not the pattern that we're seeing in the data, right? The people who are still going to church and getting married are the people who are doing fairly well. They're college-educated Americans, middle class and up, and it's the people who aren't going to college, who have the most to gain from participating in civil society, who aren't doing it. Those are, working class, non-college, minority, or white males, predominantly without a college degree, and so that forces us to think about, well, what are the intermediate institutions of today, and I don't know if we know the answer to that, really.
Michael?
Thank you. Is this on? My name is Michael Lucchese. I'm a communications consultant. I want to build on Jody's really good question about the numbers people. It seems to me that in some ways, if you're looking back at the conservative movement, the most successful part of it in the last 30 years has been the conservative legal movement. A thesis I'd like to present and get your guys' reaction to is that they won in no small part because they sort of refused to accept a sort of liberal elite consensus about the nature of the law and the way we need to make legal arguments. And they instead made these sort of constitutionalist, originalist arguments rooted in a certain idea of the American founding and a certain approach to talking about the law. It seems to me that perhaps the Richard John Neuhaus approach to talking about social conservatism and public policy is a little bit different in that he sort of accepted certain things about the elite consensus regarding the welfare state, regarding the way that public policy works. I guess I'm curious, with the example of charter schools that Mr. Weigel talked about in his opening remarks, do you think that we've been successful in promoting charter schools because we took that sort of accept certain aspects of the liberal elite consensus and use those to argue for our favored policy positions? Or have we been successful at persuading states to adopt charter schools because the charter school movement sort of refused to accept that consensus and posed a radical alternative? Thank you.
Thoughts?
I think I've thought about the charter school approach, trying to think about if there are other ways you could generalize that approach, and it's tricky, right? Because I mean, what essentially the federal role was, nobody ever would have put it like this, but was to say there is a barrier to educational reform in the form of public teachers unions. Both my parents are lifelong members of public teachers unions, so I'm not dumping on them, but they're a barrier to reform in a lot of places. So we're gonna, subsidize states to set up this workaround in the name of experimentation and personalization. And I don't actually know the history on this, but I would assume it's been mostly conservative states and Republican governors that took the federal government up on this. So in some ways, it's I think it's a rejection. certainly at the federal level of kind of the status quo and kind of conventional values at the time. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
Any other questions? All right, maybe we'll end with one. Oh, Tony?
Thanks. Tony Mills, AEI. I have a question that picks up on an earlier one, and maybe from a slightly different perspective, which is that I think clearly the civil institutions that we've been talking about that we want to be flourishing did not arise because public policy experts wanted them to fulfill their functions. But I also think that one of the real innovative virtues of To Empower People, that project, was to recognize that policy could be geared toward that recognition that these institutions played these roles, and it was an alternative to a more familiar, welfare state-driven approach to policy. But it does raise this challenge, right? Which is how do you enable these institutions to flourish for instrumental reasons, in the sense that we want these outcomes, but the institutions are not instrumentalist by nature. And I think the practical version of this question that I want to ask is, in thinking about policy now, first of all, how do we strike that balance? But particularly, how do we avoid having perverse outcomes in the policy choices we make now? In a sense, it puts people on the right of center in an awkward position, because you're forced to advocate for a kind of social engineering to undo a prior project of social engineering. And that's not just awkward, but it also raises the very risks that the older project had, which is to have these perverse unintended consequences. So what can we do about that? Thanks.
I don't know. Is that okay?
You took my answer.
Yeah, well, there you go. I speak for all of us when I say we don't know. Certainly, just defining the problem is the first step. I mean, I think the language I was using is being constructivist while we're trying to sort of promote something that's essentially like emerging, right? Something that we think should emerge from people's coming together to meet needs, right? You didn't bowl for community's sake. You bowled because bowling was fun, and it was the most fun thing you could do at night. There wasn't Netflix, right? It was the most fun thing you could do. But then in coming to bowl, there was this community thing that happened, right? But do we want to be the guy that's like, let's create fun? Let us define fun. I mean, let me just say that most colleges I've been involved with, like the group of administrators tasked with defining and funding fun events, it's usually a catastrophic failure. You're like, you don't want to go to the dance organized by the school, do you? No, you don't. There's like 3 kids go, but everybody else is down at the watering hole or doing whatever, really fun thing they're doing. So I don't know is the answer, but at least being aware that that's the nature of the problem, which I think certainly would at least lend itself towards the types of specific public policy programs that would, create, would require the application, like somebody wants to apply for a grant to do a thing, rather than kind of picking people out, right, in advance and saying, so at least kind of getting some kind of self-selecting, people have to opt in a sense, right? I think kind of the language of opting in is important.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think you do see this tension. I think in To Empower People, where they're arguing that there are good reasons to want mediating structures to do these things, that they would do them more effectively, but kind of throughout the book, it's really talking about sort of how we've all been hurt by their erosion, and so it's almost take an instrumentalist argument to revive these things, and you'll get these other things that are actually more important. I think that's what you have to hope for. I just want to read a couple of quotes. There's so much prescience in the book around this idea that weak institutions create alienation. So this is 47 years ago. They say, weak families produce uprooted individuals unsure of their direction and therefore searching for some authority. They are ideal recruits for authoritarian movements inimical to democratic society. Another quote is, one of the most debilitating results of modernization is a feeling of powerlessness in the face of institutions controlled by those whom we do not know and whose values we often do not share. It feels like they were spot on. And so, yeah, I think we try to get back there via a bank shot, which is to more effectively provide services and goods.
Although one area that I wish they were more spot on was that they have a line about how there's no political mileage in being anti-family or anti-church, and I thought, oh, I wish that were still the case. I think the other, again, I'll just I guess refer back to earlier, it's not a libertarian manifesto, and it's not a leftist manifesto. It is a little Marxist though, and they are recognizing the importance of economic benefits and economic and material goods from participating in these things. And so we have to think about what that looks like in a post-materialist society in a lot of respects, where we do, there are, much to Scott's chagrin, there are plenty of safety net programs out there that I don't think is realistic to think about ways that we could rejuvenate civil society to provide Medicaid or something. That's not realistic, and again, not what they're writing about. But what we can, and I think this is where I would really encourage our thinking to be going towards, is thinking about ways that civil society can be responding to the emptiness that people are feeling, the dissatisfaction with scrolling through Netflix at night, and figuring out if this is people's revealed preference for a life that is more single and solitary and all those sort of things. Well, where are, maybe this feeds into our next panel, but where are the ways that policy can be rejuvenating those organs of culture? And I do think that's to borrow an analogy from the Manhattan Institute's Andy Smirik, when you take the stone off the grass, it doesn't just naturally come back up. You need to have fertilizer and water and sun and all that sort of stuff. I think there is a role for policy to play to be that fertilizer to rejuvenate civil society. I think there are ways that we can be creative about spending money and how we spend it, and that's where I think the Berger Neuhaus project can help guide us towards.
Well, when you find yourself in a hole, the first rule is stop digging. I think we have one more question.
Thank you very much, and I think Mr. Weigel could relate to this. There is a book out now, just out right off the press, entitled True Confessions by Dr. Fran Mayer. And this book is a fantastic collection of examples which all of us, all of our panel members can relate to. And I've been using it as a personal handbook and inspiration in my own life. But seriously, have the churches, have all our churches, including American Catholicism, been deficient in the past, especially in the past decade or two? Is the Catholic Church getting better, especially in this country? And were the scandals which blew up after the year 2002 a good, solid wake-up call and a good lesson for Catholicism, especially in this country, to say, hey, look, we've been sitting on our laurels too long. We've got to get down to the human factor, especially when it comes to percolating down to our families and various organizations to embrace this communitarianism.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to talk about the church?
Just briefly. I want to agree. I think Fran's book is excellent, and people should pick it up if they haven't seen it already. It's available wherever, on Amazon, everywhere else. Fran's great. Absolutely, at the Catholic Information Center as well. So certainly Fran's book is great. A lot we can learn from. Have the churches been deficient? Of course they have. I mean, but I think this is part of the challenge. I mean, obviously it's not the job of public policy to kind of reform the churches. But I think the thing that I think Berger and Neuhaus ask us to consider is what it looks like when you strip churches of their job. I mean, the job of the Catholic Church for at least 150 years was to educate the children of Catholics. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't the job of the Catholic Church anymore to educate the children of Catholics. And you need to look at, more or less the 1960s. We can go back a little bit further. I think that was a kind of iatrogenic harm. Now, I don't mean entirely caused by the government. It's not entirely clear to me that a lot of Catholic bishops resisted that. There are some. So, I mean, the question just on the table, right, is would the churches be better off if they had more to do? Right? Because right now, what is the job of the churches in terms of civil society? Like, what is their job, right? If we said, well, gee, if the Catholic Church doesn't show up tomorrow, no one's going to get their checks, no one's going to get their food, nobody's going to get their teaching. There was a time when if the Catholic Church didn't show up in Miami, a bunch of the kids weren't going to get an education. So, I mean, just from the perspective of this retrospective and looking at that pamphlet, I think it's not merely the families that have been injured by having some of their jobs taken away from them, but I think churches have been weakened.
Well, just a bit of housekeeping. We'll break now, and then we're going to reconvene at 3 for the second panel and for Jody Bottom's concluding remarks. But at this time, please join me in thanking our panelists. And you're welcome to some refreshment.
This next panel, if I could invite everyone to their seats, we're going to get started. As soon as Chris Scalia sits down, we'll be able to get started. See, that trick always works. You just pick the person that you're friends with and you embarrass them, and then they sit back down and we can get things going. Is this mic now on? I think so. Okay, so great. My name is Ryan Anderson, and with Matthew Continenti, we're co-sponsoring this. I'm with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and just let me start by saying thank you to AEI. We do not have a beautiful building. We do not even have a little building. We have a nondescript office space on the middle floor of a nondescript office building, and we also don't have a beautiful auditorium. So thank you to AEI for co-sponsoring this with us. And my job here is to introduce the three panelists for this second panel. And then Matthew and I, we run in different circles. He's a Fox News power player, roundtable participant. So he ran his panel like a Sunday morning talk show where he's asking these questions. I'm a country farmer, and what I asked the panelists to do here was just prepare, an opening statement, opening comment, an opening reflection on what's changed in the culture, what new cultural challenges confront us, what some of that cultural history looks like. And so each is going to speak on a different but related topic, and then we'll open it up to questions. And so what I'll do is I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and it'll be from my far right to my near right. And I think that's actually how they are seated is also far right to near right. So first up is Scott Walter. He's currently the president of the Capital Research Center. Previously, he served in the George W. Bush administration. He was a special assistant to the president for domestic policy. Previously, he was vice president at the Philanthropy Roundtable. He was the editor of Philanthropy magazine. He's written for a variety of outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. He's a Georgetown graduate. He was a senior fellow at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, and he once was here at AEI, and he was the editor of several AEI publications. And he was a research assistant to Michael Novak, a close collaborator to Neuhaus and Berger and to George Weigel. Next is Carolyn Bowman. She's just became an Emerita distinguished senior fellow here at AEI after a long career at AEI. Back in the 1980s, she started the Election Watch, the longest running political analysis program in Washington. She's really an expert on all things public opinion, so much so that, I guess now 4 years ago, she received the prestigious Warren J. Makovsky Award for Excellence in Public Opinion Research, which is one of the most prestigious awards in that field. She's the author of a number of extensive public opinion studies here at AEI, including the exit polls, a history and trends over time from 1972 to 2020. And then something that should be very relevant to at least some of us in the room, quote, the title is Attitudes About Abortion, a Comprehensive Review of Polls from the 1970s to Today. And that came out 3 years ago. So especially in light of some of the post-Dobbs challenges that the pro-life movement has had, that will be a helpful resource. And then last, and certainly least, is Nathaniel Peters, director of the Morningside Institute. Nathaniel's a friend of mine, which is why I can harass him slightly during this panel. Nathaniel did his undergraduate at Swarthmore College, a master's in theological studies at Notre Dame, and then a PhD in historical theology at Boston College. He and I worked together at the journal First Things for what ended up being the last couple of years of Father Neuhaus's life. And so Nathaniel got to live with and work for Father Neuhaus, and he'll be able to share some reflections of that as well. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Scott. Oh, you can use the podium if you, yeah.
Well, thanks so much. It's a great honor to be here with such distinguished company and also to talk about such an important topic, sort of local community. And I'm going to especially focus on its history, the political and intellectual history. But I'm also going to talk about its enemies, because my day job is looking at the hard left. We sit here saying, oh, this is all wonderful, and how to get more of this wonderful thing. Not everybody does. So I'm going to start with a quote, and I want somebody to see if anybody here can guess who wrote it and when, okay? Liberals empathize more with nearly any group in the United States than the lower middle class white or the ethnic voter.
They have found ways to sympathize with Black consciousness, with the consciousnesses of Indians and Chicanos, and their literary sensibility has been refreshed by the great surge of Jewish writing. Yet they tend to think of lower middle-class whites as racists, militarists, and crypto-fascists. Who said it and when? There's an AEI connection here. It was Michael Novak in 1971, 2 years after he wrote A Theology for Radical Politics, and 1 year before he worked on the George McGovern campaign. Okay? Now, less than a decade from writing that, he would be here at AEI, interestingly, that's itself an interesting story. So this is probably the beginning of his turn to the right, arguably. I want to have one more snippet from The Unmeltable Ethnics. And when he says WASPs, which is sort of the bad guys in the book, I think our proper equation would be elites, okay? So in moral competition, WASPs, elites, always win. Ethnics, for example, who were once not American enough, are now too American. WASPs are consistently correct. It is a mixed tribute to educated liberal Protestants that one can count upon them to recognize some new guilt in themselves almost monthly, annually at least. So now, as I said, I was here at AEI starting in '83 with Michael for about a decade and a half, one way or another. And there were a lot of other things percolating at that time at AEI. So you had not just Michael, who, as was mentioned, was one of Neuhaus's closest allies, along with George here. They were once called the Trinity. You also had Robert Nisbet here. You had Bob Woodson talking about his great successes of things that he had helped with. You also had Bill Shambra, who knows more about this than I will ever know. Baruti Sr., Bill Baruti Sr. was the president who originally brought in some of these folks, and he was terribly important. He was Catholic. He also was an interesting ethnicity. He was Lebanese. And he was influential in the Reagan campaign and even the Republican Party platform. So he helped to shape things like these words in Reagan's convention acceptance speech. This convention has shown to all America a party united with positive programs for solving the nation's problems, a party ready to build a new consensus with all those across the land who share a community of values embodied in these words: family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. Now, that Michael actually had as a mantra, family, work, neighborhood, and wrote about it in GOP publications by the time of Reagan. So there's another thing worth pointing out is the GOP platform, in which Bill Baruti definitely had an influence on, begins sounding like traditional individualistic, but then becomes more community. Our case for the individual is stronger than ever. A defense of the individual against government was never more needed, and we will continue to mount it. But we will redefine and broaden the debate by transcending the narrow terms of government and the individual. Those are not the only two realities in America. Our society consists of more than that, so should political debate. We will reemphasize those vital communities like the family, the neighborhood, the workplace, and others, which are found at the center of society between the government and the individual. We'll restore and strengthen their ability to solve problems in the places where people spend their daily lives and can turn to each other for support and help. How does that sound for those of you who just reread To Empower People? So another person important in influencing Reagan in this direction was somebody who's often forgotten in this history, and that's John McLowry, a passionate defender of this in Vermont. Now, I'm told that he wrote Baruti after To Empower People with a little complaint that he thought that the pamphlet did not do enough to respect the other folks who'd been working in this area beforehand, didn't mention them enough. And Chambra's thought was that it was a touch maybe too social science-y in hopes of trying to look to appear to be above politics. But In any event, everybody should get McClowry's memoir of the real history of all these efforts in Reagan, in Nixon even, and other places to push this sort of thing in policy. It's called Promoting Civil Society Among the Heathen, and you can get it online at the Front Porch Republic website. There's another person that's more the political history. In the intellectual history, there's another person who's largely forgotten now, which is very unfortunate, Richard Cornell. He's the guy who actually coined the term independent sector, right? Which then later was seized upon, and they created a trade group, effectively, of charities and the like, called independent sector. Now, the irony is that was created in 1980, so right in our timeline here, but at its first meeting, Daniel Patrick Moynihan gave a chilling speech in 1980. This is early 1980, right? You don't even know who's going to win the election. He is saying, we are seeing the collapse of Western civilization, his term, because the government is consuming the entire private sector. And by the way, he was especially worried about charities becoming too dependent on government money. That was the first year that Catholic Charities was majority government funded, and he thought that was a very bad sign. But anyway, a bit more about Richard Cornell, who was another person that you really, if you want to understand this whole tradition, you've got to read. Part of his problem is he was always ahead of his time, as far as I can tell, right? So in the 40s, he's a kid, roughly. He's studying under von Mises and learning criticisms of big government that, nobody would take seriously, for decades after that. Then in the 50s, he becomes a program officer at the Volcker Fund. Anybody heard of the Volcker Fund? Oh, I'm impressed. It was one of the very first non-lefty philanthropies in America, trying to influence public policy in a way that, of course, many more would in years to come. So that's the 50s. In the 60s, Cornell writes his first book, Reclaiming the American Dream. And that's where he coined independent sector. It was full of use of Tocqueville, which, other than Nisbet, nobody at that time was talking about. By the end of the 60s, that work led to Cornell being asked by Richard Nixon, yes, to set up a federal task force to encourage voluntary action, right? The precursor to H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light and the faith-based community initiatives that both George W. and then Barack Obama kind of would endorse. So, and by the way, he didn't just attack big government, he also attacked big business. In the 70s, he wrote a book, Demanaging America, about how our big businesses desperately need to flatten their hierarchies because that's not going to lead to business flourishing either. In all of these different things, there's one key word, I think, that sums up Cornell: independence, right? That was his lodestar. He believed that ordinary people in ordinary places should have a large scope for action, whether they're raising families, building businesses, running local government, or coming to the aid of their neighbor. And I'll give you just a taste of the way he saw that from that book of about that time. The systematic, irrational disconnection of ordinary people from the business of society, a radical constriction of the definition of the citizen's role. In the end, the only opportunities left to ordinary Americans are voting and paying taxes on time. They've been prejudged incompetent to do much else. Even voluntary organizations, themselves altered by the rationalization philosophy, assumed ordinary people could not be directly involved in helping each other out of poverty. So, as I said, by the way, big philanthropy was another bad guy for him. So, touch more of the history before I conclude here, and this is, I'm stealing from Bill Shambra, who is the acknowledged expert for all things like this at this point. He points out that on the left, around the time of the To Empower People book, there actually was a lot of localist sentiment. Carter emphasized the importance of family and neighborhoods. And he made Father Gino Baroni, a famous lefty localist organizer, an assistant HUD secretary for neighborhoods. It also went through Bill Bradley and even Al Gore. There was a pitched battle between Bill Galston, pushing faith-based localism, and someone else on the centralist secular left about whether or not Gore, in his 2000 campaign, should have some answer to George W.'s compassionate conservatism. And Galston won the fight. Galston and Will Marshall's New Democrat manifesto was also very localist. And Marshall gave a presentation to the Bradley Foundation board in 1994 that was almost obsequiously, Shambra says, pro-Bradley's theme of the new citizenship, the localism and communities. So Bill made me swear I would add this tidbit because it connects Novak and AEI and one of Novak's other efforts, Catholicism in Crisis magazine, or Crisis magazine. When we ran at Crisis, because I worked for Michael at Crisis at that point, we ran a big talk by Bill Shambra at AEI's 40th anniversary gathering on Nisbet's quest for community, right? And a guy named Bill Gavin, who wrote a book called Street Corner Conservative, sent that on to Peggy Noonan because she'd asked for advice on George H.W.'s acceptance speech in '88. And that is where the 1,000 Points of Light comes from. So once again, AEI in the center. Now, the interesting thing about this is AEI put out a very valuable 20th edition of To Empower People, much bigger than the pamphlet, with a lot of essays and thoughts and this and that. And at the very end, you have Michael Novak giving this as his final word, right? We think the political party, this is 96, right? We think the political party that best makes mediating structures the North Star of a new bipartisan agenda will dominate practical politics for the next 50 years. And why? Because this is more deeply rooted in the original ground and genius of the American experiment. Now, I don't disagree with that. And in fact, the interesting thing is, this tradition has always had appeal to non-conservatives, right? So here's a book from not too many years ago, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind, right? Guess who's the first blurber? Janet Yellen, noted decentralist. Even better, right? I told you John McClowery is so important in this tradition. This is one of his books, The Vermont Papers, Recreating Democracy on a Human Scale. He was concerned that Vermont, decades ago, was too centralized, right? Now, would you care to guess? So he's writing the book about Vermont, so of course he has a mayor blurbing it. Can anybody guess what mayor? You know, Steve? Who? Bernie Sanders, another noted decentralist. So this is, right, this is the great question to me of this whole conference, that there is a powerful appeal to communities, localism, decentralization, right? But, you know, I was there in W's administration, and compassionate conservatism was very far from a big success. All these other efforts didn't seem to come to too much. And I don't think I have the final answer on that, but I have the beginnings of an answer, I think. One is the obvious, that the omnivorous state is very hard to fight back against, right? Everything is easily crushed by that steamroller, including its money alone is crushing in many ways. Another is, of course, politicians have no incentives here, right? I'm going to say, Austin, we want you to do a lot more for yourself. I'm going to do less for you. That's great, right? And then Ryan stands up and says, no, I'm going to give you all kinds of good stuff, right? And you don't have to do more. You have to do less. We'll take care of you. That's not a lot of incentives there. Plus, remember, compassionate conservatism didn't even win with Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson immediately came out against compassionate conservatism, saying reasonably, and like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, we don't want your money. We don't want your money. You're going to take us, it's dangerous. So I think the answer goes back to the quote from Michael that I started with about that contempt for ordinary people in flyover country. Conversely, Michael's view that this tradition is the tradition of America's founding, right? But those WASP elites and their now non-WASP progeny, they're still guilt-ridden, they're still self-loathing, and they especially loathe ordinary Americans. By the way, Hispanics are about to be added as another ethnicity to be loathed. George Soros this year refused to fund Hispanic get-out-the-vote efforts the way he normally does, because they're not behaving properly for him. So I think that Tocqueville, who of course in a way began this whole great tradition, I think he should be given the final word and explanation. This is from his Ancien Régime book that nobody ever reads anymore. Our quarrel is not about the value of freedom per se, but stems from our opinion of our fellow man. A man's admiration of absolute government is proportionate to the contempt he feels for those around him.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for inviting me, and Matt for asking me to talk about some contemporary survey data. And thank you, Scott, for that wonderful, lively introduction. If data is the plural of anecdote, I'd like to begin with two anecdotes very quickly. During my 4 decades, yes, 4 decades at AEI, I've had scores of interns. And an amateur sociologist that I am, I began asking them very early on about their plans and hopes for the future. And I noticed that early on, perhaps for my first 15 years at AEI, when I talked to these young people, they said they were going to, after leaving AEI, they're going to get the law degree or the fancy degree at the Kennedy School, and they were going to come back to Washington where they really felt they were going to make a difference. But starting in the late 1980s, I began to get some very different answers. Again, very talented young people. Most of them said after their time at AEI, they were going to go back and get a law degree or a public policy degree. But they began to tell me, not all of them, but a significant number of them, that they planned to return to their hometowns or to mid-sized cities where they really thought they could make a difference. I felt enthusiastic then about mediating institutions, about the kind of work that these very talented young people schooled in to empower people could do in their local communities. Second anecdote. I recently became emeritus, as Ryan said, and in my semi-retirement, I started reading the 3 local Alexandria, Virginia newspapers. While I was working in DC, and there were a lot of long hours, that kind of thing, I confess I looked at them very quickly. I basically read the restaurant reviews and looked at real estate prices. But I was simply bowled over by the news stories about the activities of a wide array of voluntary institutions, little platoons everywhere. Yes, there were also long lists of groups in these papers about groups that needed help and needed volunteers and, of course, needed money. But the number and diversity of these associations seeking to meet human needs was truly impressive. I'm sure many of them encounter the kinds of problems that were discussed as impediments to mediating institutions in the 1996 edition of the book, but these institutions appear to be so remarkably healthy. Let me touch on the main areas that Berger and Neuhaus identified: neighborhoods, churches, and families in terms of contemporary survey data. Polls are a very blunt and crude instrument. They can't give you the kinds of nuances that Catherine did with her ethnographic research. There is very blunt overall. And there are several themes that are consistent in the polls, and I think that most of you know what these are. For decades, Americans have been very dissatisfied with Washington. Majorities of around 55% continue to tell Gallup that government is doing too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses. But on that question, Democrats and Republicans are mirror images of one another. 70% of Democrats say government should be doing a lot more, and 70% of Republicans say that more things ought to be left to individuals. Of course, if you ask about a bigger government with more taxes or a smaller government with less taxes, small government always wins. For decades, in poll after poll, Americans have rated their local government much more highly than Washington in terms of confidence and satisfaction. In Gallup's 2023 question, twice as many people had confidence in local government to solve problems in their area as had confidence in Congress or separately the federal government to solve domestic problems. A Pew Research Center survey recently asked people to identify the most important issue in their local community and then asked who should solve it. Local leaders was the top response, followed by individuals, with Washington ranking very far down that list. In the abstract, people believe that the federal government can solve problems, but they haven't believed it's been doing so for at least 2 decades. And these longstanding beliefs make a good time, I think, for a renewed push to revitalize ideas surrounding mediating institutions. Beyond these important generalities, we're handicapped in learning a lot more about what's going on in neighborhoods today because pollsters and their media partners are biased and obsessed by national politics. One of the most familiar questions asked if the country is headed on the right track or are we seriously off in the wrong direction. Today, about 20% say that we're on the right track, and about 2/3 or more say that we're usually on the wrong track. This question was asked for the first time in 1973. The country has been on the right track only 3 times since 1973. In 1984 and 85, during Reagan's presidency, during Morning in America, then again at the turn of the century when the budget was briefly balanced and the economy was doing exceptionally well, and then also briefly after 9/11. But very few pollsters have probed what that wrong track response means. When people are given the chance to respond in their own words about why they think country is on the wrong track, a significant wrong track response concerns the decline of the nation's civic fabric. When you care deeply about something, you're concerned about its decline. Beyond the presidential contest and Trump's trials, the national polls, as I said, cover incessantly national politics, and there just aren't many in-depth explorations about the health of neighborhoods and families. The kind of longitudinal, attitudinal data about local involvement that Robert Putnam used, the attitudinal data that is, in Bowling alone, is not readily available in the public domain today. There's a lot of material on churches and religion, in part because of Gallup's longstanding interest in the subject, but you really have to dig to find good information on neighborhoods and families. Pollsters today, following their media partners' sensibilities, also consistently accentuate how we're falling short as a democracy. There's a lot to be concerned about, obviously, but that steady drumbeat of negative views reinforces the familiar media storyline that things aren't going well across the board. But it just isn't true. Americans' views about their own prospects continue to be fairly positive. When you look at the limited data we have about neighborhoods, a picture that's fairly optimistic emerges. We've heard a great deal lately about white rural rage, but when asked in a Robert Wood Johnson survey to rate their overall quality of life, about 3/4 of rural residents rated it as excellent or good, including about 1/4 that rated it as excellent. A majority of rural adults said that people like them can make an impact in their community, including more than 1/4 who believe that they could make a big impact. More than 6 in 10 belong to a health, social, or community service group in this poll. Nearly half, 49%, had volunteered time to an organization working to make their community a better place to live. This is hardly a picture of rage, though the theme has gotten a great deal of national media attention. One fairly new survey project, the American Communities Project, looked at 15 different community types on questions about national and local life. The survey's design is very complicated, but with a large sample, it's possible to look, for example, at LDS communities, at African American communities in the South, at aging farmland communities, at college towns, at Hispanic centers, and at evangelical hubs, to name just a few of the 15 communities types that the project examines. There are significant differences between and within these communities about national level hot button issues such as abortion, but on a range of neighborhood issues there was significant agreement. The principal researchers wrote that the vast majority felt their own lives were on the right track, and nearly 2/3 gave that response about their neighborhoods. Let's review some of that data. Nearly 6 in 10 people across most of these community types would not move to a different community if their finances and circumstances allowed them to do so. The strongest response on this question came from 2 different communities, aging farmland communities and Native American communities. The people who said they were inclined to leave were people in community types they called big cities. 70% or more in each of these 15 different community types rated services as excellent or good in their communities. In only 2 community types, African Americans in the South and those living on Native American lands, did fewer than 60% rate their local police as excellent or good. These two communities also stood out in terms of rating their schools poorly. 58% overall rated their local schools as excellent or good. Perhaps more important in assessing the health of mediating institutions, nearly 3 in 10 across these community types had volunteered at a religious or non-religious organization in the past year. Of course, the responses for the LDS community were off the charts on that question. But when asked a more specific question, 73% across all of these community types overall had helped a relative, friend, or neighbor in their community with a small task. Nearly half, 48%, had done so for a large task. 53% said that they donated money for the community's benefit. In another battery, at a time we hear so much about alienation and loneliness, a solid majority, 63%, felt that they belonged in their neighborhood, and a strong plurality felt connected to it. When asked whether they had a say about what goes on in their community, 30% agreed, 32% disagreed, and the rest were in the middle. The survey data couldn't tell me whether there were more healthy little platoons than in the past or what impediments they faced, but neighborhoods may be healthier than we think. Turning to religion and family, and to pick up on the comment that you made earlier in the first panel, Berger and Neuhaus wrote that there was little political mileage in being anti-family or anti-church. I think that's still largely true, but these institutions seem much less strong and more contested than in the past. In 1939, when Gallup asked for the first time about the influence of religion in their community, more people said it was decreasing than increasing, but the margin was very close. The last time Gallup asked that question in 2023, the gap was huge. 75% said religion was losing its influence in their community, while only 22% said it was increasing. Pollsters who ask the follow-up question about whether that is a good or a bad thing for society consistently find that most people say that this is a bad thing. The bad thing sentiment, of course, hasn't done much for actual participation. To quickly recap, the proportion of Americans with no religious identification, the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, has risen from 9% in Gallup's data in 2000 to 2003 to 28% in Pew's most recent data. A larger share of the youngest age group fall into the nones category. These nones can be agnostics, atheists, or simply people with no religion in particular. Intensity always matters in surveys, and today 45%, down from around 60% 4 decades ago in 1992, say religion is very important in their lives. Church or synagogue membership fell below a majority in 2020 for the first time in Gallup's long trend. Just a quarter century ago, 70% said they were a member. Now it's 47%. Today, 3 in 10 attend religious services every week or almost every week, 25% seldom attend, and 31% never do. This is especially true for young people, of course, many of whose parents did not go to church. Countering some of these dismal stats is a growing body of research that suggests that active religious involvement, and I think what Catherine certainly talked about, provides community and a sense of belonging that can act as a buffer to social isolation and loneliness and promote mental well-being. Pew reports that those with no religious affiliation, the nones, tend to vote less often, do less volunteer work in their communities, and follow public affairs at a lower rate than religiously affiliated people. But the lower rates of civic engagement are concentrated among the nones who say that their religion is nothing in particular. Atheists and agnostics tend to participate in civic life, Pew says, at rates matching or exceeding religiously affiliated people. The polarization that has infected so many institutions has affected religion, and my AEI colleague Dan Cox has pointed out that secular Americans, and I'm quoting him directly, who were once apathetic about religion have become more hostile. As Pew points out, 43% of the nones think religion does more harm than good, and only 14% more good than harm. Another 43% says it does an equal amount of both. For nearly a decade, the Deseret News and BYU have done very substantial yearly surveys that provide the best contemporary data that we have on the weaknesses of family life and on the institution of the family. Just as an aside, one of the principal investigators on the project was one of those AEI RAs who left AEI, got his PhD at Stanford, but then went back to his local community and is now doing impressive survey work there. We've heard a great deal about identity politics in recent years, and I urge them to include a question about how important various things were to people's personal identities. The top response by far, mentioned by 7 in 10, was being a parent, followed by being a spouse. The next highest response was religion. 43% said that was central to their identity, and 37% said their career was. But race and political party that we hear so much about in terms of identities were far behind in terms of importance to identity. In their 2023 survey, the authors wrote at length about the trajectory of families in their everyday lives and families as an institution, and the family as an institution. They argued that in terms of daily life, families are doing pretty well, although of course they face challenges and difficulties. And the challenges, of course, are very different from what they were when Neuhaus and Berger wrote in 1977. But today, as then, they do not vary significantly across ideological or political lines. Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals are concerned about finding quality family time, about job stress, and about the cost of raising families. When asked about families generally, the top challenge was the cost of raising a family, followed by social media. The BYU team noted that the left is souring on marriage despite the fact that policy surrounding marriage has moved in a much more liberal and, some say, inclusive direction. The left see it as more of a burden than a benefit, they say. While the left wants government to do more, they leave, according to the authors, quote, the most important institutional support for children, the family, off their agenda. The right, in their view, while strongly supporting marriage, is less willing to help the institution through federal support. One can argue about whether federal help is the best way to support families, but I think it's an important distinction nonetheless. But in their work, support for the family as an institution is highly politicized and also affected by sex. This is especially true among the young in college. Most still want to marry, but young men and young women differ about how desirable it is and whether it'll even be possible. Young people are marrying later and delaying childbirth, and more women will not have children at all. Berger and Neuhaus, I think, are still correct that there's little mileage being anti-family or anti-church, but the religious and family landscapes are contested in a way that was not the case when they wrote To Empower People. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here to remember Father Neuhaus, though I have to confess that when Ryan said he was just a country farmer, I wondered whether I was going to be one of the lambs that he leads to his wife's slaughter knife. As I finished reading To Empower People, which I did for the first time for this, I had two thoughts. First, reading the book, for me at least, was like opening a time capsule. It made some critiques that could be taken from our own time alongside analyses that are no longer true, as some of our previous panelists have mentioned. But second, I think the argument endures, and the task of many in my generation will be to build, sustain, and protect mediating structures that will hand on our spiritual and cultural traditions, and we hope thereby renew our country. So first, some of the things I think that To Empower People, if not got right, then some of the things that are still true today for us. I think in To Empower People, you hear echoes of the arguments of Chris Caldwell, of Ryan, and others on the way in which the intellectual and legal frameworks of the civil rights movement have been superimposed onto other political debates to great and unfortunate effect. We also see Berger and Neuhaus noting that economics and values associated with middle-class status are key to overcoming racism. And we hear that from folks like Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter. And there's even a nice long paragraph of what today would sound like post-liberalism on how conservatism in America is in fact old-style liberalism. It's the laissez-faire ideology of the period from before the New Deal. Both the old faith in the market and the new faith in government share the abstract thought patterns of the big bad Enlightenment. I added big bad there, but otherwise that's verbatim. And today's conservatism typically exhibits the weakness of the left in reverse. It's highly sensitive to the alienations of big government, but blind to the analogous effects of big business, right? So I think reading something like this is a salutary example that many of our salutary occasion to be reminded that many of our country's problems and new conservative diagnoses of them may in fact be a little older than we're given to think. But in this case, many of the diagnoses are true. The good and necessary battles against racism in which Neuhaus once fought provided a potent narrative to push social changes that he would later go on to oppose. But since 1977, the spirit of radically autonomous self-actualization has pushed American society and mores, especially among the young, in extreme directions that Neuhaus and Berger just didn't foresee. Let me offer maybe 3 examples of that. So first, as has been touched on a little bit, there's our national understanding of sexuality and human nature. The line you've now heard again and again about little political mileage and being anti-family or anti-church, but there are a couple of stronger lines. Here's one, quote, "The promotion of diverse sexual and lifestyle liberations seems to be doing little empirically viable damage to devotion to the family ideal," unquote. And they argue that any family, regardless of structure and values, can do the job, quote, "as long as they provide children the loving and the permanent structure that traditional families typically have provided," unquote. I think this, Ryan can correct me on this. The second of those is at this point demonstrably false, and the evidence for the first and the third isn't looking too good either. Second, Neuhaus and Berger write that when it comes to American religion, quote, "whatever decline there was from the apex of the late 1950s has now stopped or been reversed." Well, as we've just been hearing, that's also unfortunately false. I think Neuhaus and Berger were correct in seeing that secularism per se wasn't the future of America, but it turns out that neither is institutional religion. And that more often, it seems, although I'm happy to be corrected on this, mainline Protestantism is ending not in atheism, but in the privatized spirituality and progressive ethics of the nuns. And kind of by way of anecdote of what this looks like, when a friend of mine recently asked her online students in a Catholic university class to describe different kinds of prayer that they know, she received responses including, quote, "I am a pagan, Hellenic to be exact," unquote, and "I practice forest bathing," capital F, capital B, recognized as a legitimate form of therapy. "The only thing keeping ourselves from growth and enlightenment is ourselves." Now, I think if Richard were here, he'd note that St. Paul would agree that the only thing keeping us from enlightenment is ourselves. And Richard also might have noted that there was a robust practice of forest bathing among the hermits of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, at least in the parts of Christendom with forests. But today we're left thinking about how religious institutions can serve as mediating structures when there are fewer people in them, when they have less respect and less influence, especially among elites. Third, and I want to touch on it only briefly, Neuhaus and Berger repeatedly talk about diversifying our national media culture and giving widespread access to sources outside the hegemony of the major networks. They definitely got their wish with social media and the internet, but unfortunately their wish came with a couple of other things, like an exacerbation of our national divisions, the fueling of conspiracy theories, the harming of our children, and the diminishment of the social value of legitimate forms of expertise. In addition, I think radical autonomy has not only changed what we believe about moral questions, but how we interact, right? So we're very familiar with the idea of the little platoons, but it strikes me, and I think some others have touched on this too, it may be that big government or big business kind of create circumstances or create incentives to nudge people out of little platoons. But I think in many cases, people choose to opt out of families. They choose to opt out of religious communities. And at the risk of sounding like Pauline Kael analyzing Nixon voters, no acquaintance my own age is a member of a Rotary Club, an Elks Lodge, or the Freemasons. Which are kind of classic mediating structures. So Neuhaus and Berger write, cohesion exacts its price in loss of personal freedom. Freedom may be paid for in the coin of alienation and loneliness. And it strikes me that we've made our choice and are living with its costs. I think one of those costs is the erosion of the middle ground, especially among younger generations, right? And it can be easy to exaggerate this. You know, we see polls about how Americans overwhelmingly agree on the right to vote or the freedom of assembly. But I think more and more, again, especially younger Americans, feel like the work of building consensus across sides just isn't worth the effort, right? So in academic guilds, you might find that people just can't agree on the rules of the game. Paul Griffiths, the Duke theologian, described this as one group of theologians coming in wanting to play cricket, the other wanting to play baseball. And so they end up in a place of kind of mutual incomprehension. And instead of having a contest over whether the established institutions are going to play one way or the other, they just go off and they create new teams and new leagues. And so you end up with two simultaneously running institutions that don't really have much overlap. I'm not sure how to sort of solve that, but I think it does go to underscore the strategic challenge of creating more of those mediating structures when the big institution can't be turned around, right? And that's not to say, I'm saying this, I'm not trying to sort of make an advocacy for withdrawal from politics, right? We need robust political governance. We need religious people involved in that task. I don't think these are mutually dependent. But we need to recognize that many of our established mediating structures aren't the bearers of culture and learning that they once were. And so we're going to need to create new ones. There are, I think, a couple of promising examples of this, and then I'll step down and look forward to the discussion. The first promising example is the creation of classical schools, right? Some of which are charter schools, which we've talked about. They come in a variety of forms, but their common good around which they're organized is teaching serious thinking, rhetoric and writing, mathematics, and a joyful engagement with the great works of the Western tradition. And this makes them attractive to parents of differing convictions. Another promising sort of set of mediating structures, at the risk of tooting my own horn, are the numerous para-academic organizations and programs popping up around the country, whether they're programs in civic leadership at land-grant universities, Great Books honors tracks, Christian study centers, independent institutes like my own. Father Neuhaus liked to say of large established organizations he was a part of, we're going to turn this thing around. And I think increasingly in my generation, we recognize we're not going to turn many of these things around. But that doesn't mean that we should just abandon them. They're still influential. They still shape a lot of young people. And there's still room to help people within them pursue the goods for which they were founded. So I think the solution is not to retreat, not to write off, but to build anew. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you to all three panelists for excellent presentations. Let me first turn to you to see if anyone wants to respond to anything that any of the other panelists said. And if not, we'll turn it to the audience. And so, Steve Hayward. Oh, yeah. Sorry, wait. There are rules here. This is a classy institution. Someone will bring you a microphone, and then you will be able to ask the question. And that way, the live stream audience and the archived video will live forever.
Yeah, I think Guy was unprepared for you to go to questions so quickly. Both the first panel and then this one, especially Carlin, have mentioned and I guess you might say danced around the centrality of family policy. And, you know, both Carlin sort of referred to it in the previous panel. Well, we don't really have one, at least that's coherent and deliberate. And the best we can do is, well, let's fiddle with the tax code. That's, you know, we've been doing this forever. If we got a problem, well, we can start with the tax code because we know how to do that. We've been doing that forever. And then I was sort of struck as Scott was going through what you might call the orbiting electrons around Neuhaus and Berger. So Bill also got a mention, and Moynihan and all these other people. And I think also the national conservatives, many of them saying we need to have a family policy. And I'm wondering if maybe the one person who has not been mentioned and whose disposition might be the path out of it was Daniel Bell, certainly well known to Berger and Neuhaus. And remember, it's been years since I've read him, but remember he described his disposition as a socialist in economics and a conservative in cultural values. And I keep thinking maybe that's the disposition that should be recaptured now to try and figure out a way out of our box. And so we're not just talking about tax code changes. That's more of that's a provocation meant as a question for anybody.
Well, go ahead.
No. Someone.
just as a brute empirical fact, this is something Frank Buckley has written about. When you do the four quadrants, right, of laissez-faire to socialist and social liberal to social conservative, the sweet spot is exactly, if not, I'd hate to say socialist, that's pretty extreme, but certainly not conservative libertarian economically, but socially conservative. That's, even now, that is our sweet spot. That's, the national conservatives, the sort of Trump phenomenon, which I think always has to be looked at as a symptom, not a, distinct thing, but a symptom of things, bigger things going on. That is still the sweet spot. Now, whether that means that the political system or people's actual lives will conform to that very much, I don't know. That's a tougher question. I will say, speaking of AEI, more than once I heard the great Irving Kristol at AEI say, there's nothing wrong with this country that a good, long depression couldn't cure.
I think, Steve, you certainly know the Gallup question that asks people what they would prefer, and I think the answer is overwhelmingly conservative economic policy and liberalism in social policy. So that's what we're fighting.
I would just add, especially as one of the less economically literate people in the room, that part of the problem, and I think Catherine touched on this in her remarks, is that you're having to convince young people who don't really believe that a family is a sort of a necessary or a worthy good or something worth the sacrifice. You're having to convince them to sort of make short-term investments, to make sacrifices now that might pay later dividends, and that even have rewards now, but that aren't as apparent from the beginning in the way that they will be later on. So I remain a little skeptical that, if we just tweak this about the tax code, or if we just offered this benefit, that would overcome the kind of self-centeredness, and not even necessarily in a bad word or in a bad way, but also there's a kind of myopia or a kind of lowering of the horizon. And there's only so much that policy can do about that families, churches, and schools are going to have to step up to.
Yes.
I come to you from the dismal swamp of the people. And my question is, I really think you all captured the positive stuff that's going on out there. I personally, my question is, could it be a lot better than you realize? I think it is. I've never seen such creativity, such energy since the summer of 2020. It is so exciting out there, virtually across the board, in all that Empower the People is about, which is, the third leg of the stool. So that's my statement. I really see that, and I think I could justify it. I think you all have been in Washington too long.
Well, Deborah and Jim Fallows, who've been writing books about their little, I guess they go biplane to a lot of communities around the country, would certainly second what you've said, because the first thing they do is go to the local library to figure out what's going on, and they share your conviction completely that what's really happening out there is just an enormous amount of creativity and local public policies solving problems with people of left and right coming together. So.
Scott, I liked you starting off with Novak on the unmeltable ethnics and the contempt that the WASPs had for them. Of course, the thing that they cared about the most at the time that Nixon ran on and that the WASPs perhaps had the most contempt of them for was what they called social issues, which was crime. Rampant crime in the United States in the 1970s. It's because of the Warren Court, for the most part, imposing all sorts of rules on policing. It's a problem that we essentially solved at the local level. You've got what happened in New York with Rudy Giuliani and the Manhattan Institute. Attorney General Barr went on a roadshow after George Bush left office, promoting his weed and seed policy. You weed out the recidivist criminals, and then you seed the local community with good stuff to try to take something put something into place. And it worked shockingly well. But over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a collapse of that. You've seen a nationwide rise in the crime rate. It's largely through local communities deciding that they essentially want more crime and disorder. And I'm wondering, is there any nexus between sort of the hard policies of crime and public disorder that we largely tackled and are now rising again, and the sort of more abstract questions of community that we're having a hard time sort of wrapping our arms around? I mean, if it's too dangerous to go outside, why not just sit home and watch Netflix all day?
Well, that's an interesting question and a little sprawling, probably more sprawling than my little brain can manage. But you're right that it was elite. You know, the crime problem was largely caused by ridiculous elites back then in the court system, and now, of course, it's caused by George Soros. And by the way, Zuckerberg, I hate to tell you, Zuckerberg also is very big on the same kind of thing. It's just other than Capital Research Center, nobody reports that. But so. It is disturbing. At the same time, though, you know, the deep cause of crime in the places where it is rampant, in addition to not having proper legal system, is the collapse of the family among a chunk of America. Now, somebody else who had great success in this, by the way, that I mentioned, Bob Woodson here at AEI, has run spectacular programs in the most gang-ridden parts of big cities. But of course, that required religiosity in a big way, typically. And it also required, you know, the recovered addict, the recovered gang leader, the recovery that is central to, you know, sort of the Christian story, right, of change. And while it would be much better for America if Soros and others weren't trying to tear down normal, sane law enforcement, it's also true that there are going to be people who are highly problematic, and they deserve more than just the idea of jail, right? Chuck Colson, another great hero in this tradition that we're talking about, learned from his own incarceration, thanks to Watergate, about the need to help people in prison. And so I don't think it's just the bad elites there.
Other questions? Okay, then I have a question for the panel. One of the things that Neuhaus and Berger either, I'll say they downplay it, given the quote that Nathaniel read, is how the culture war intersects with civil society. Patrick Brown mentioned this a little bit in the answer to one of the questions he was asked in the previous panel, looking at something like Mozilla Firefox and Brendan Eich or Memories Pizzeria in Indiana. I mean, it strikes me that an added challenge we have right now is that if we want to devolve authority to the local level, school choice programs, things like this, the various intersection mapping on of the anti-discrimination regime. We've seen various states that have attempted to pass voucher programs. The kind of roadblock that they hit is, well, you can't then use state money if your schools discriminate on a protected class, and then, you know, which sort of protected classes get added on, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see how this could play out? Carlin, I was struck by the statistic you read that, what was it, 60% of the nuns think religion is a force for ill? 43% think it's a force for ill. How is that going to play out as we get more polarized and more secularized? And many of the mediating institutions that do this work that Catherine was mentioning, the life-giving religious traditions, and then people in power having a low viewpoint of those institutions on some of these divisive culture war issues.
If I can answer your question with a question, one of the questions that I have, just applying this to religious liberty, is it seems like in my generation, many people, especially in the nuns category, see religion as kind of my strong personal feelings about identity that I have in this area. And that's one of many areas of feelings about identity that I have. So religion is kind of on par with sexuality or gender or whatever. Religion isn't a kind of human duty that I have that's connected to truths I perceive in a kind of more traditional way of thinking about religion, at least in our country and its constitutional history. So what happens when that more identitarian view of religion makes its way to the appellate courts and the Supreme Court? And that's what religion means when you're asking questions about religious liberty. I find that's a very pessimistic thought in my mind. It makes me grateful for good work that can be done now, for good precedents that can be set now that will hopefully make bad precedents harder to set in the future. But I would hypothesize one of the issues that we're going to have is just what we understand by religion and how and why it should receive any kind of protections, especially in contest with or contrast to sort of other identity markers.
So I'll say something in answer to Nathaniel's question there. I think one sign of hope for me, it's a local story of Montgomery County, Maryland. A group of public school student parents, Orthodox Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all got together and then they sued the school board because they weren't allowing their kids to opt out of like various LGBT Pride Month indoctrination sessions. And so here it may very well be that the religious liberty jurors, and they've lost at the trial level, so I think it's now on appeal to the Fourth Circuit, and the Beckett Fund is representing them. But it may very well be a religious liberty argument that helps win the day there. But it also strikes me that there's a new potential coalition here. I mean, getting Orthodox Jews and Muslims, and there was different stripes of Protestants and Catholics, all seeing the value of, in this case, this is a very minor form of school choice, right? Opting out of a bad ideological indoctrination program. But then like the more holistic answer would be, why doesn't Montgomery County have school choice, right? They don't have vouchers, they don't have ESAs, they don't have charter schools. I mean, I think that's the direction that Catherine from the previous panel would want to push us on is, how can we return the proper locus of authority for education to be to parents, and then one of the delivery mechanisms of education being the church, rather than government-run public schools, and so that just as a way of answering that question, it may very well be that the religious liberty coalitions that are forming are the beginning of a broader pushback on this. Any other questions? Yes, over here, Patrick.
Just a really quick one, Ryan, since you brought up Memories Pizza, and for those who don't have as strong a memory of this, in the wake of your Berger decision, this is a pizzeria in some small town in Indiana that was asked by a local news reporter whether they would serve their pizza at a gay wedding. And they said no, and they became a national firestorm. Politicians weighing in from across the country, and this is something that the To Empower People framework is. Why should we care what a small town in Indiana wants to do? Let Kokomo be Kokomo, right? But that's clearly not what the left has in mind. And I do wonder if in certain corners of the right, we also see a sort of robust, well, the only problem with it is that it's not our values that are being advanced by the apparatus of the administrative state. We just need a strong conservative leader who's willing to make sure that whatever you want to take that logic out to its natural conclusion. So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel, but maybe Nathaniel, since we're picking on him today, would think about if there is an appetite on the right for this sort of restraint in carving out space for Memories Pizza, or is the future of the right and the left going to be just a war of using the administrative state to their own ends?
I mean, I worry more about the former in a way that I didn't, I worry more about the latter in the way that I didn't maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Certainly when I was a junior fellow at First Things, that wouldn't have given me much thought. But my sense, and it's helpful to have polling data because senses can be skewed. In my case, I'm not in Washington, D.C. I'm in New York City, which might even be worse for these purposes. I mean, my sense is that there are many young people, especially many vocal and politically active ones, who are increasingly dissatisfied with the kind of compromises that a pluralistic democracy has to make in order to function. And there's a greater sense of, no, this is an obvious good. Why have our elders, forebears, not defended it, not tried to kind of instantiate it enough, and especially use state power to do so? It remains to be seen whether they will discover some of the prudential reasons for why those goods were not instantiated through either the power of the purse or the sword. But in my mind, and I'm very happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, I see more kind of fragmentation and sort of contests about the instantiation of who's good and whose vision of the good, to a greater degree than my parents did.
Yeah, I was going to say that I was hoping that Carlin in her polls would talk about a very recent poll, which was Scott Rasmussen's very high 1%, only the top 1% was, it's 150,000 in income, you live in a big city, and you have a graduate degree, actually have a graduate degree. And the views of those people had never really been studied before, but Rasmussen over the years had noticed, like, I keep having, every time I do a national poll, I have just a few of these weird outliers, right? Just totally off the board. So he started noticing that they had those characteristics. And so he got Steve Moore to give him money to do a couple of polls of them. And it's truly shocking. I mean, you talk about polarization. That is America's polarization in black and white. And that's part of the problem, right? I mean, we speaking of whether things are better than we think, maybe sort of, because 3/4 of America believes about 3/4 of what people in this room believe. But on the other hand, that's not remotely represented in the halls of Congress, in Harvard, at Meta, et cetera. So you have this bizarre conflict between an elite that is completely out of touch with all the rest, that creates this horrific friction that begins to look like Muslims and Hindus on the Indian subcontinent before the partition.
Well, when I was rereading this, I remember Neuhaus quoting Berger and saying that America, in this case, it was about sort of secularism versus religion. America is a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes, India being a very religious country, Sweden being a much more secular country. And I thought, well, the problem has been that the Swedishness has been contagious, and that now all of a sudden there are more and more Indians moving in a Swedish direction.
Okay, please join me in thanking our panel. We're going to take a 7-minute break, and then at 4:15, please be right back in your seats, and Jody will finish us out. Interrupt. I'm going to ask people to take seats one more time before I have to call out Austin Ruse by name. It got too long. Sorry to interrupt the conversations. I just want to convene this last session for Jody Bottom's closing remarks. For those of you who don't know Jody's probably one of the leading cultural critics, essayists, and poets working in the United States today. He's currently an associate professor and the director of the Classics Institute at Dakota State University. And he's a professor of like ancient philosophy and classical languages and literature. But the Classics Institute, I only learned this by looking into it. It's an acronym that stands, I forget the exact translation, but he's bringing more or less like how to think using classical wisdom about modern technologies and AI and digital technologies and ethics for modern technology. He's widely published. He's published The Decline of the Novel, and a previous book before that, An Anxious Age, The Post-Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of America. Previously, he was the literary editor for the Weekly Standard. He was, while doing that, he was the poetry editor for First Things. Then he was the editor of First Things. Then he was the editor-in-chief of First Things. He also is my former boss, and he's the man who taught me how to write. When I arrived at First Things, having majored in music, Jody would once a week do writing tutorials with me. And he was the first person who ever asked me the question, do you listen to how your writing sounds? To which my reply was, no. Writing is an instrument for conveying ideas and arguments. It's not music. It's not art. And Jody was like, all right, you got to stop thinking that way. So Jody has the distinction of having been instrumental in my career, both my thinking and my writing. And it's a great honor to get to welcome him to the podium.
So, everyone else has covered to empower people. We've heard from 8 speakers so far, 9, counting George, that I'm not sure what there is left to say. So we can just let it go at that. But except for Scott connecting some of the pieces in, Scott Walter connecting some of the pieces in previous and subsequent thinkers about libertarian or about communitarianism, there's been a little bit underdone of history, both the biographical history of Richard and Peter, and kind of why this book occurred then. What was in their minds? So, you know, for us to think about here nearly 50 years on. So let me give a little context, historical and biographical. To do that, though, we have to start with something awful, something no one wants, something truly gag-inducing. We have to revisit the 1970s. Now, the point is to try to figure out what was in Peter Berger and Richard John Neuhaus's minds at the time, to reconstruct what they saw in the culture, to guess at what they sensed, both consciously and unconsciously, about the state of America at the bicentennial. What in that moment historically, what in their thinking biographically made them write this essay at that time? A 76 essay published in 77. Along the way, for your benefit, I'll try to reduce to a minimum references to 1970s bell-bottoms, 1970s discos, and that 1970s nadir of church music and church architecture. Those of you who are young should go down on your knees and thank God tonight for the grace of not being alive the year that Captain and Tennille had a major hit with a song called Muskrat Love. Politically, the 1970s certainly set up where we are today in 2024. McGovern lost the 1972 election in historically bad fashion. I wanted to run for president in the worst way, he would later say, and I did. But his reformation of the party's delegate selection was long-lasting, essentially an attempt to make sure the Democrats were never embarrassed again by the protests that had happened at the 1968 convention in Chicago, which Richard John Neuhaus helped organize, getting arrested at the time in Chicago, on the streets of Chicago, with the now seldom mentioned black comedian Dick Gregory. The Clinton-era creation of superdelegates for the Democrats, the Democratic Convention, was itself a 1990s attempt to wrest some party control back from the kids and radicals whom McGovern had enabled. But McGovern's chief strategist for all of that, a man named Fred Dutton, wrote a prescient small book in 1971 called Changing Sources of Power. And Dutton's argument was that the old FDR 1930s coalition, the joining of the liberal upper class doyens, the ethnic Catholic working class, the big city political machines, and the solid voting bloc of the Jim Crow South was an embarrassment. More, Dutton said, a new coalition of university students, inner city blacks, and suburban women was large enough that the Democrats could ditch the Catholics and the Southerners who were holding back progressivism and still win elections. In 1972, he proved wildly mistaken. But now? In 1974, Nixon was driven from office by his own missteps, but missteps as magnified by the hundreds of young lawyers relentlessly investigating him, the young Hillary Clinton among them, who were the first hint of the rising political power of what Peter Berger would later call the knowledge class. And 1974 also saw the election of new Democrats to Congress in the most ideological class since the radical Republicans of 1866. The victory of Jimmy Carter in the 1976 Democratic primaries was in some ways a correction, an attempt to turn against that knowledge class radicalism that threatened the electoral prospects of the Democratic Party. Now, Carter would prove an epically bad president. But who knew that in 1976? To empower people was, in one sense, advice to the likes of Carter from two younger public intellectuals who were from the far left, but growing increasingly worried about what the left was doing. Richard, for example, won the Catholic Press Award in 1969. He used to say it was easier to win Catholic awards when he was a Lutheran than it became once he changed to Catholicism. And 1969 was the peak of his influence as one of the founders of Clergy and Laity Concerned About Vietnam, as an anti-Vietnam movement activist. 1969, he still wins the Catholic Press Award for a Commonweal op-ed saying the pro-abortion flag is being planted on the wrong side of the Democratic-Republican divide. It ought to be those heartless conservatives who want to eliminate the children of the poor. It ought to be us good liberals who want to expand the community of care to include the unborn. Meanwhile, the old world of the Kiwanis and the Elks and the Oddfellows and the Masons and even the Knights of Columbus was showing cracks, though few perceived it. A friend once pointed out that the sexual revolution, which is another thing that's happening here, was not exactly a 1960s thing, even though the pill had appeared. It was limited at the time, in fact, to a swath of upper middle class college students. It was really in the 1970s that it was handed on, and we have a name, or that it was expanded, and we have a name for that 1970s expansion of the sexual revolution down to the working class. We call it disco. But the main thing we need to remember is the first cracks in the mainline church's background, the backstopping of America. Perhaps the curious thing about the disappearance of the old Protestant ascendancy of the mainline is how little remembered it is. In To Empower People, the authors call the damaged piece religion. That's the influence of Peter, who was always interested in the institutional church sociologically rather than the individual congregations, the bricks and mortar churches. But the effect of those mainline churches was fading on a fantastically accelerated curve. And the result, you can read all this, by the way, in my book, An Anxious Age, but the result was something felt, even if not fully predicting the magnitude, by these two prominent and serious Lutheran authors. They clearly had a feeling down in their bones that something was amiss. Some new weakness had entered the religious ascendancy that they had taken for granted. The major American churches formed the flow of American culture. Tocqueville had noted them in the 1830s. They fought with one another bitterly, but somehow together they formed what he called the central current of American manners and morals. And you know what Tocqueville meant. Those churches gave us the shape of birth and baptism, death and funeral. They defined the family, they controlled charity, and they especially contributed to the sense that politics was less important than the great cosmic drama of the individual soul's redemption. You can see it in their art. The average French prostitute in Zola has greater political awareness than the main characters of our American fiction. Our great novels are about Huck Finn lighting out for the Indian Territory, or Captain Ahab fighting a metaphysical battle on the ocean, or the long stain of scarlet adultery. Together, the Protestant churches gave us an ersatz established religion, a pseudo-national church, with many of the political theory advantages in what Spinoza would call theopolitics of a state religion, while not requiring many of the disadvantages of a government-run and government-controlled church-state or state church. And Richard and Peter, at this moment, could see it breaking. They could feel the weakening of the Tocquevillian center. In 1976, in the 77 essay, they blamed it on the government's turn against mediating institutions. In 1975, in the Hartford Declaration, they blamed it on modernist theology. It was not a moment of clarity about what is perhaps why it wasn't, or about what was going on, which is perhaps why it wasn't until the 90s and early 2000s that communitarianism actually held much of a place in American public discourse. To understand Richard and Peter's true place in all this, we would have to dive into the denominational history, looking at the impending breakup of the Lutheran Church of America and the American Lutheran Church and the Missouri Synod, and the walkout by the modernists from Concordia Seminary to found Seminex, the seminary in exile, and all the rest of the minutiae of Lutheranism in those days. And I'm not sure it would be helpful, except perhaps to explain why Richard would become a Catholic a decade and a half later. But the thing to think about all of it might be this: Richard and Peter were, in one sense, insiders in that old Protestant ascendancy. They were connected to all the old institutions, they knew the theological players, and they had weight behind their opinions. In another sense, however, they were outsiders. Lutherans had always had an uneasy relation with the other churches in what would come to be called the Main Line and the National Council of Churches. Well into the 1950s, the Lutherans were generally against prohibition in the 1920s, for example, as you might expect, given that they were all German and Scandinavian beer drinkers. Richard and Peter were, in 1976 and 77, more radically progressive in their politics than much of the old establishment, while also more theologically conservative, which a combination that left flummoxed an enemy like Harvey Cox and even a friend like William Sloane Coffin. For those of you who are young, Cox at Harvard and Coffin at Yale, these were names to conjure with once upon a time, powers in academia, church theology, and even public discourse, Time magazine cover figures. Faded now to shadow, of course. The two authors of To Empower People were also, I want to suggest, personally in a strange place in 1976 and 77. Peter Berger, 7 years older than Richard and far more prominent outside of activism at that time. In a sense, the mid-1970s were the peak for Peter. not intellectually. He would go on to do much more, and not in his influence outside the United States, which would expand from there. But the writing that compelled academia to take him seriously and sociologists to grapple with him was in truth behind him by 1976. The best-selling sociology textbook he wrote, 1963. His claiming of the great tradition of sociology centered on religion, the metaphysical reality of the numinous order, and spiritual anxiety as a social phenomenon. In other words, his place alongside Durkheim and Weber was in the 1967 Sacred Canopy and the 1969 Rumor of Angels. Even the vastly cited 1966 book he co-wrote with Thomas Luckman, The Social Construction of Reality, was moving him to the outside of his discipline. For Berger thought that the social construction of reality meant that civil wrongs could be corrected, while Luckman thought that the social construction of reality meant that society itself could be deconstructed. And in the end, Luckman won in academia. In Richard John Neuhaus's case, almost the opposite is true. He was an activist and inner-city Lutheran pastor who hadn't written anything important in public intellectual life before the mid-1970s. His still kind of lefty American theopolitics Time Toward Home was 1975. His mature worry about American law and elite opinion, The Naked Public Square, was 1986. His 1989 conversion and 1990 ordination as a Catholic priest caused a real cooling of the old friendship with Peter, and they eventually became, at least partly and unofficially, estranged. One of his moral disciplines was keeping a diary, which I burned, because he had asked me to do so on his sickbed before he died. I won't say much about it, but it was thousands and thousands of typed pages. And a good part was the setting down of the quick and cruel observations he had made during the day as a way of training himself not to say them aloud. It didn't always work. Matt Continetti and Ryan asked me to tell an anecdote or two about Richard, so here's one. In 1990 or so, Richard was on the 700 Club. Again, a blast from the past. This was Pat Robertson's cable television show, had a big audience, and Pat Robertson had run mostly as a protest candidate in the Republican primaries in 1988 against the picking of George Bush Sr. as the presumptive Republican nominee, and did surprisingly well. And Bush still won, stomped him, but there was, he did better than you would have thought. So Richard's on the television show, 1990 or so, and the director tells him, well, when you see this light go off, the microphones are off, but the camera's going to keep rolling while the credits appear, right? And we want you to keep talking to Pat Robertson. So it looks like the audience has just dropped in, and caught part of a conversation. So the director tells this to Richard, the light comes on and he and Pat are still talking, Pat Robertson are still talking, and Richard says to him, so Pat, are you thinking of running for president again? And Pat Robertson says so unctuously, I'm not thinking about it, I'm praying about it. And Richard told me he could feel rising up from his gut, reaching his gullet into his mouth. He tried to stop himself and he couldn't. And he said to Pat Robertson, do you always pray without thinking? And Pat Robertson didn't speak to him for a few years after that. Now, Matt and Ryan asked me to leave some time for questions about today's discussions, so let me just conclude with this. The political history of the 1970s tells us something about what Peter L. Berger and Richard John Neuhaus were seeing presciently that would lead them to write to empower people. And so their personal situation, tell us something about what was in the minds and hearts that would prompt them in 1976 and 77 to urge what would later come to be called communitarianism. There was a weakness in the pluralism of America, a crack in the broad-shouldered democracy, a diverting of Tocqueville's central current that was not what they had imagined or hoped would come out of the civil rights and anti-Vietnam victories that they had won in the decade before. They could feel it going wrong, and they latched for an explanation and a possible solution on a sociologically inflected piece of advice to give the Democratic likes of the incoming Jimmy Carter. A Burkean and Tocquevillian history of mediating institutions invisible to federal bureaucrats, ignored by practical political theorists such as Fred Dutton, and unknown to the radical Democratic class of Congress in 1974. In all that, Peter Berger and Richard John Neuhaus were, I think, absolutely right. It would take the rest of the public intellectual world over 2 decades with the publication of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone to catch up with them. Thank you. Wrap it up there? Okay, any questions? George?
That again, Jody, that was terrific. Let's try to connect the Hartford appeal and to empower people and some of the discussion today. I mean, to what extent do you think, based on your that terrific book, An Anxious Age, that the meltdown of theological seriousness in the main line that was critiqued by the Hartford appeal, which Harvey Cox would be a perfect example, helps account for why over the next 30 or 40 years, as you say, on this vastly accelerating curve, the main line, as Richard used to say, became the old line and is now the sideline. And this ballast in the American experiment simply disappeared. I mean, do you connect the two in your own mind?
I mean, the rough figures, if you count the black churches that are affiliated with the mainline churches, really roughly speaking, 50% of America belonged to one of 7 denominations in 1965. That number today is under 10%. This is the largest sociological change maybe in American history, and nobody paid any attention to it as these mainline Protestant churches collapsed. Now, some of them became evangelicals, some of them, like Richard, became Catholic, but most of them, I argue, in An Anxious Age, drifted off to become these post-Protestants who still hold this belief of their Protestant forebears that they are the center of America as moral judgment. They just no longer have to listen to an occasional sermon about hypocrisy anymore. They are, in Flannery O'Connor's phrase, the Church of Christ without Christ. And that's the argument I make there. Now, why did it happen? I think I've never chosen a single explanation. I think it was overdetermined. There were many things going on. Modernist theology was certainly there, and I do trace a central line of this to the social gospel movement and Rauschenbusch. Rauschenbusch is the guy who said, it's meaningless to say Christ died for the sins of a Tennessee miner who beats his wife. Right? He died for the sake of these social destructions, and he bore their pain upon his body. Rauschenbusch was a wonderful rhetorician, I think very underappreciated as an American writer. He says, I'm still trying to sell Ryan on this stuff. Right? Richard Rorty was Rauschenbusch's grandson. But there is a line there. Rauschenbusch eventually is kind of forced intellectually to name the 7 social sins. And if you look at them, these are identically the social sins embraced or denounced by wokeism. It's militarism, it's mob rule, the rule by the ignorant. It's, if you go through that list of 7, they are astonishingly identical. So if we had to blame it on theology, I would trace it to the triumph of the social gospel movement over the theological conservatives of, that were around in the 20s, writing really brilliantly. And in Lutheranism, Lutheranism was much more ethnic at the time. It didn't have that strange thing going on until the Lutheran Church of America woke up one day in like 1969, 1970, looked at Concordia Seminary and discovered where Richard had gone. Robert Wilken was there. Yaroslav, the great patristic scholar, Yaroslav Pelikan was there. This was a base of American Lutheran seriousness. They looked up, Pete Korn had just died, and they saw that every single faculty member was a modernist who said, well, the Bible's not inerrant, we can't. It's symbolic. And the Lutheran Church recoiled. And, it was the modernist liberal professoriate at Concordia who marched out and formed the seminary in exile. This is one of the few cases of a mainline American church where the conservatives actually won one of these battles. Instead of, it was the conservatives walking out to protest, as they had in the 20s, right? They had to go start their own seminary in Philadelphia. Lutheranism complicates the issue, but I think generally speaking, if we identify it as social gospel rather than just modernist, and the Hartford Statement clearly looks at the conditions here, these kind of claims that, I use this metaphor out of Wittgenstein in An Anxious Age, that for the social gospel movement, it's Christ who teaches all of this, but he's the ladder. And once you climb that ladder up to the higher ledge of morality, you no longer need the ladder. Right? And that's a Wittgensteinian metaphor. And I think a lot of that Richard and Peter perceived in the Hartford Declaration. And, they did the whole 1950s era Protestant Catholic Jew thing, but really, and there were Catholics at the Hartford Declaration. Avery Dulles was there. There's at least one other priest there. And then they had a couple of Orthodox, Hopko and a couple other Orthodox, but mostly it was, what? Yeah, William Sloane Coffin came and signed it. Stan Hauerwas, signed it. Stan was a wonderful, maybe the most influential American academic of his generation, if you look at number of dissertations and theses he oversaw. And Stan was, an amazing theologian who showed up or who had helped prepare the Hartford Declaration and then signed it, even though he couldn't come up for it. William Sloane Coffin came, and William Sloane Coffin was a friend who never really understood Richard, but they were friends. And so, what had happened at that moment, they still believed in the Protestant ascendancy. They thought we just have to get it right in 1976. By 1989, I think Richard thought it was dead. And, and you needed to let it go. And for those of you who are young here today, you have no memory of this at all. It seems astonishing to you to say there was a world in which the Episcopalians, the Northern Baptists, the disciples of Christ were one of the founding members when Eisenhower flew up from Washington to lay the cornerstone of the National Council of Churches building in New York, because it was such an American institution. And those days are just so gone. But Richard and Peter are still riding out of that world in 1976, 1975, when they do the Hartford Declaration. They still thought the old Protestant ascendancy could be fixed, or what was Nathaniel's phrase that he quoted from Richard, we're going to turn this thing around. Right? We're going to turn around the Protestant Reformation in this country. And of course, the curve only increased. now. And now, as I say, those of you who are young have no idea that this was America for 200 years. This was our Mississippi. Jews and Catholics were sometimes, often, tolerated on the banks of that river, but they were never the river. The river that Tocqueville saw, the central current of manners and morals, was the rival Protestant churches who, even though they fought each other, and the two seeds in the Spirit Baptists were never going to be the same as the Green River Baptists, and they hated each other and anathematized each other and said they were going to hell, but together they formed a national church with all the advantages of a state church and none of the disadvantages.
The Catholics and the Jews are here on sufferance.
When Bill Buckley published God and Man at Yale after he'd finished his undergraduate degree, would have been 52. And Regnery made his father gave him $50,000, which in 1952 was a lot of money, to promote the book. Regnery published it, and it became a cause célèbre that would make his next part of his career. McGregor Burns, was that his name? Yeah, wrote a piece sort of saying, this is a brat throwing a hissy fit. He'd always been a brat. He would only agree to join, he'd been invited to join Bones, the Skull and Bones Club, eating club, the secretive eating club. And he would only agree to do it if they would give him a special exemption to their oath of secrecy that he could reveal it in the confessional. And he wasn't ever going to do that. It was just him being a brat, right, at Yale. Anyway, he publishes this, and McGregor Burns writes a piece, I think in The Atlantic, saying it's ridiculous, he's just being a brat. Of course Yale is a Christian school. Of course Yale is a Protestant school. And his problem is that he was a Catholic and didn't appreciate that this Protestant Christendom, the broad-shouldered Protestant Christendom that is Yale. And, it seemed quite right at the time. Was that Burns or McGeorge? It was McGeorge Bundy. Burns is somebody else. Right. And that was a world, as I say, that's gone. Richard and Peter were writing out of it, and it's important to remember that, I think, to understand why they felt compelled to write this essay at that moment and their subsequent intellectual lives. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry to cut us off, but we have to vacate the room. So thank you for all. Enterprise Institute for hosting us this afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you at a future event.